Belinda and Harper Audio Australia present this unabridged recording of Outback Dreams, Bunyip Bay, Book 1, written by Rachel Johns and read by Casey Withers. Author's note. Dear listener, the idea for Outback Dreams started forming the year my middle son started full-time school. He wound up in the principal's office 3 times in his first term, and this didn't bother him one bit. Eventually, due to his behaviour in class and at home, a psychologist was called in, and he was tested for a number of things, including autism. During the time we were speaking with the psychologist, I did a lot of reading around autism and Asperger's syndrome. Although my son was eventually cleared of being on the autism spectrum, I knew that if he had been diagnosed, it wouldn't have affected just him, but us as parents, and also his brothers. People with autism are often highly intelligent people who struggle to fit in with certain ideals of the world. I decided I wanted to explore this issue in a book, so I gave my gorgeous hero Daniel Montgomery an autistic brother, who had influenced his life in many ways. In essence, this book is still a romance, with lots of other threads, including 2 of my favourite romance hooks. I won't say what they are, so as not to give the plot away. Oh, and by the way, this book is the first in at least 3 linked books about the people of Bunyip Bay. It's the first time I've ever embarked on a series, and although each book will be a standalone, there are a few storylines running through the books, and I hope you'll forgive me for leaving those unfinished for now. I promise all will be revealed in Outback Blaze and Outback Ghost. I hope you enjoy this book, and as usual would love to hear from listeners either on Facebook or Twitter, or through my website at www.racheljohns.com. Happy reading. Kiss, Rachel. Dedication. For Mum. Many people think they have the best mother in the world, but I know. Acknowledgements. It's hard to believe I now have 5 published books to my name. The excitement of seeing a new cover and spotting my books on the shop shelves will never get old, and it makes the sometimes hard work of writing a novel all worthwhile. Without readers and listeners, this dream would not be possible. So I want to thank each and every one of you who has bought and enjoyed one of my books. Thank you for the emails and messages on my Facebook page. You cannot imagine how these small notes make my day. This dream would also not be possible without the support of my fabulous publisher, Harlequin Australia, and to the awesome team there. Hayley, Lilia, Christina, Michelle, and all the other wonderful people who work together to bring my books to life. Thank you all. Thanks also to my brilliant editor, Lachlan Jobbins, who once again read my rough draft and immediately knew what I was trying to achieve. A big thank you to Helen Brightweiser from the Cornerstone Agency, who read my Aussie book Jilted on a trip home from Down Under and cried so much the flight attendant asked her if she was okay. Thanks for believing in me and my writing, and for taking us both on. Once again, my writing support team didn't fail me. Thanks to Beck Sampson, Catherine Hine, Jeanette Radevsky, Joanne Dannon, Melissa Smith, Fiona Palmer, Fiona Lowe, and the Sassy sisters for believing in me when I didn't. Also to our friend and employee Lynn Beverley, who is a constant champion for my writing, and to Holly Payne, who read the first half of this book and told me it was even better than Jilted and Mandrout. I'm blessed with amazing friends. A special thanks to Sue Hillier, a reader and Facebook friend, who read Outback Dreams and paid particular attention to the autistic angle. She has personal experience with autism, and I thank her for ensuring I wrote this book with the empathy I desired. And finally, to my family. Without their support, none of this would be possible. Prologue.
I
10-year-old Daniel Montgomery ran from the only house he'd ever called home, slamming the door behind him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slammed a door. His little brother couldn't handle loud, sudden noises, but the rage inside him right now warranted it. How could his parents do this to him? How could they even contemplate selling the farm and moving to the city? Of all the ridiculous places, what did the city have to offer except stupidly tall buildings and more shops than anyone would ever need in their life? He tried to tell himself it wasn't his brother's fault. Will would be quite happy spending the rest of his life on the farm, catching spiders and aligning furniture around the house. But of course it was Will's fault. His parents wanted more for him. Yet no one asked Monty. No one cared what he thought or what happened to him. He ran to find the only person he knew would understand. He ran next door to Forrester's Rock, where Faith lived. But next door in the country wasn't a mere leap over the fence like it would be in the city. He hated the thought of living so close to other people. It was a good few kilometres over paddocks and hills. He ran as the crow flies, that's what adults said, didn't they? And he didn't see another soul until Faith's house appeared, and he saw her swinging off the rope in the old gum tree. He'd missed that rope. On his few visits to Perth, he hadn't seen any ropes hanging from backyard trees. All the city kids had those bright-coloured plastic swing sets that you couldn't even make go high if you swung your legs as hard as ever. Grimacing at that thought, Monty pushed his burning legs harder. He raced across the last bit of the paddock, leapt the wire fence, and shouted, "Faith!" She glanced his way, smiled, let go of the rope, and sailed through the air to meet him. When she got close, her face fell. "What's the matter?" she asked. He stopped, his breath ragged as he ran a hand over his sweaty face. He knew it would be as bright as a tomato. "We're moving," he panted, delivering the blow in 2 devastating words. "What?" Faith screwed up her face as if she couldn't comprehend what he was saying. He took another deep breath. "Mum and Dad have sold the farm. We're moving to Perth next week." "What?" Faith said again. He wondered if it was suddenly the only word in her vocabulary. She sank down onto the lawn, about the only green grass in the region, and he sat down beside her. It was like a bad dream. "They didn't tell me until now because they didn't want to worry me." Monty scoffed and thumped his fist against the ground. "That's what they said, anyway. Truth is, they didn't tell me because they don't give a damn what I think." He'd never used such harsh language before, and it made him feel grown up, even while he was sulking. "Why?" Faith asked, her voice quiet, as if she might be about to cry. Faith never cried, not like the girls at school who burst into tears at the tiniest thing, like if a mouse scuttled across the classroom floor. Her name and long brown hair in a messy ponytail were the only things girly about Faith. People called her a tomboy, but Monty didn't care. She was his best mate. Leaving her behind would be as horrid as leaving the farm. "Because of Will. Mum's tired of driving back and forth to Perth for all his therapy, and the high school up here might not be equipped for him. They said they're thinking ahead." But as far as Monty was concerned, they weren't thinking at all. How could selling the farm be a good thing? It had been in the family for generations. "Oh, well, that royally sucks." "You can say that again." "What am I going to do in the city?" "Maybe you could join a chess club or the Boy Scouts." Faith tossed a grin his way, obviously trying to make him feel better. He scowled and thumped her in the side. They both sighed and stared out across the garden to the paddocks of Forrester's Rock. Big cylinder hay bales littered the ground. There were identical ones back at his place. Hay baling was one of his favourite parts of farming. Only a week ago he'd been working alongside his dad, who hadn't mentioned even once that this would be his last chance to do it. Grown-ups were so unfair. "I was always going to be a farmer." Monty felt tears welling up in the corners of his eyes. He fought them hard, trying to keep hold of his anger. "You still will be," Faith said with determination. "The best. But what good's a farmer without a farm?" Faith mused for a few moments and then said, "Maybe you could marry me and live here." Monty snorted. You're right. It's ridiculous. Faith laughed. She didn't even know if she wanted to get married anyway. As far as she could see, the only reason to get married was to have babies, and she wasn't very sure about them either. She'd never liked playing with dolls. Sitting around toying with tea sets drove her berserk, and you didn't want to get her started on makeup. Like Monty, she wanted to be a farmer, outside from dawn to dusk, ploughing the dirt, shearing, crutching, mustering stock. That's why she played with the boys at school and steered clear of the girls. "Maybe your parents could adopt me," Monty said, interrupting her thoughts. "Now that would be fabulous." He already stayed with them often enough when his mum and Will went to Perth. She grinned at the idea as she wiped her eyes, not wanting to cry in front of Monty. Not wanting to cry, full stop. Only sissies cried. But how was she ever going to get through each day without him? Who would catch frogs with her by the dam? Who would climb trees and do silly dares with her? Ryan never wanted to play the same games. He was only 3 years old, but thought himself a man already. She couldn't even interest him when mud pies and catapults were on the table. "I'm going to be bored out of my brains without you," she said, staring glumly at the ground. Monty grabbed her hand and squeezed hard. "You won't forget me though, will you?" "Never. We'll be friends forever." Although she squeezed back, Faith didn't look at Monty. If she did, she'd definitely cry. Chapter 1. What in God's name am I doing here? Faith Forrester didn't get her underarms or bikini line waxed. She didn't drink skim milk when there was perfectly good full cream stuff available from the cow, and she didn't run marathons. So why on earth had she agreed to come to a school reunion? She'd hated boarding school and hadn't stayed in touch with any of the girls in her year. Taking a sip of expensive champagne, she glanced around the room. The one difference between here and hell being that here they served good grog, and imagined Monty laughing as she described it. Overlooking the Swan River in all its sparkling nighttime glory, the decor and atmosphere at the yacht club were about as far from the palace in Bunyip Bay as you could get. But it wasn't just her surroundings that were top of the wazza. Everything from the background music to the guests' outfits screamed glamour and class. She should have listened to him when he told her not to bother coming, that nothing and no one from school would have changed. Trying not to look too awkward standing on her lonesome by the bar, she sipped another mouthful of the almost sickly sweet bubbly and nearly didn't notice a tall, thin, peroxide blonde sidle up beside her. "Oh, my! If it isn't Faith Forrester!" Faith tried not to flinch as the woman air-kissed her and scraped long, hugely impractical, bright red fingernails over her arms as she hugged her. She was surprised that Kat, head girl of Perth Ladies' College a decade ago, even remembered her name. They'd not spoken more than 2 words in high school. "What are you doing hiding all the way over here in the corner?" Faith bit her tongue on a sarcastic reply. The better question was why she'd come in the first place. Lord knew she'd never had any inclination before, not since that first time, almost 10 years ago, when she'd spent all evening alone. Where many boarding schools were full of farmers' kids, hers had catered to the Perth elite, and she had never fit in with these posh ladies. Nothing had changed. She was still just a country girl, and now her school pals were married to lawyers and doctors, just like their mothers had been. Not that she'd ever called any of them pals. She'd got through private school hell with her head down, her nose in books, mostly novels about country kids, and her focus on the weekend when she could escape the prison and catch up with Monty. But when the invitation to this year's old girls' function had landed in her post office box, something had twitched inside her. She'd forgotten the downside of these events and pounced on the opportunity to do something different for a change, something to liven up her otherwise depressingly dull existence. Mulling these thoughts over, Faith suddenly realised Katerina Lamborusco, whatever her married name was, expected an answer. She was standing there smiling like plastic and looking Faith up and down like some sort of exhibit in the museum. "Well, what's your excuse for hiding in the corner?" "Just taking a breather," Faith said eventually. Kat giggled in a manner that grated on Faith's nerves. It is a bit overwhelming, isn't it? Catching up with all these old friends. So what have you been up to lately? And there it was. A slight variation on the dreaded question, which was really just a polite way to ask if anyone had seen fit to marry Faith and let her breed. The answer was no. It didn't make an inch of difference that this was supposed to be a modern world. Things like husbands and babies still mattered, and if you fell short in that department, you'd better have a jolly good reason, such as becoming the youngest partner in a law firm, or making it big time on a catwalk in Paris. Unfortunately, Faith couldn't tick either of those boxes. When she didn't reply, Kat leaned a little closer and wiggled her immaculate eyebrows. Her gaze glued on the unadorned finger wrapped around Faith's glass, she asked, "Is there a lucky man?" Faith swallowed, and the words fell from her lips without her thinking them through. "Yes, there is, actually." Good Lord, have I just invented a boyfriend? While she lamented this disturbing fact, Kat's eyes literally glistened with excitement as she beckoned to someone across the room. Faith downed half her glass of bubbly as a whole horde of women formed a circle around her, just like something out of a horror movie. "Faith's just about to tell us about her man," Kat sang, informing her little posse. The girls who'd hung on her every word at school apparently still did. "Ooh," came the replies. "Do tell." Faith's throat went dry. She wanted another drink, but somehow her glass had emptied. "Well," she said, aware 10 eyes were trained on her, "his name's Monty." Eyebrows rose in unison. "That's a nickname, obviously," she rushed, wondering why she cared what any of them thought. She never used to. "His full name is Daniel Montgomery." "Montgomery?" Kat tried the surname on for size. "Sounds hot." Her posse laughed. Faith thought about her best friend. "Oh, he is," she said, stifling a laugh, because she'd never thought about Monty in that way at all. Ever. They'd grown up together. He was the brother she'd wished she could swap her own with. That said, half the women in Bunyip Bay had swooned after him at some stage or other. "What's he look like then?" asked another former student as she raised her glass. "Is he tall, dark, and delicious?" "He's tall," Faith nodded, thinking about how she had to jog to keep up with Monty's big strides. "But not dark. He's got golden blonde hair." She smiled. "But he's very tanned from being outdoors lots." "I feel faint." Kat placed a hand theatrically against her chest. The rest of them giggled. "What does he do?" Faith opened her mouth to say jack of all trades, but caught herself. This was supposed to be a fantasy. "Monty's a farmer." "Oh, so he's landed gentry." One of the women actually clapped. Faith summoned a smile, nodded, and then pretended to take another sip from her now empty glass. This was why she'd hated boarding school. Even though her family were lucky enough to be fairly well-to-do, one of the farming families who could afford not to stress over the odd bad season, she'd never felt comfortable with the class system her prestigious boarding school classmates clung to. Quite frankly, she didn't give a damn how much money a person had, whether 6 generations had owned their property, what suburb they lived in, whether their father was a judge and their mother a charity queen, yada yada yada. She cared about what was inside, whether a person could make her laugh when she wanted to cry, was there for her in times of need, and didn't judge her by her outfit. Yes, she'd noticed the looks her fellow old girls had given her when she'd first entered the yacht club. So she wasn't wearing a cocktail dress or heels that would give a ruler a run for its money, and maybe her mousy brown mid-length hair wasn't shiny and straight, but she was comfy in her look. While the women around her nattered on about her imaginary boyfriend, Faith giggled inwardly at the fact that this was her best going-out outfit. Knee-high boots, leggings, and a chiffon tunic were far removed from her normal uniform of shorts or jeans, depending on the season, tee or flannelette shirt, and her Blundstones. Tonight, she was even wearing makeup. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," boomed a microphoned voice from a raised platform at the front of the room. "Welcome to our annual alumni cocktail party and the presentation of Ms. Alumna of the Year." The women around Faith scattered to find their business-suited husbands, and Faith stood alone at the edge of the room, nursing her empty champagne flute. As you know, continued the principal, tonight we celebrate our former students' successes in fundraising for charities in need. Perth Ladies College is proud of our Ms. Alumna Award, and the continued support by our students and old girls is admirable. It's hard to believe the award is now in its 25th year. I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Priscilla Morgan Brooks, organiser of this outstanding initiative, to announce this year's finalists. Faith scanned the faces all around her. Amongst these women, being crowned Ms. Alumna of the Year was akin to winning a Miss World title. To enter, you had to organise a fundraising event for a charity near to your heart, garner the support and attention of the media, thus giving the school good publicity, and raise the most money of all the entrants. Faith had never thought too highly of the award, which in the Old Girls magazine always seemed like yet another way for some women to draw attention to themselves. But as she listened to the list of finalists and their achievements, she wondered if she'd been too quick to judge. How could you be anything but positive about a woman who rode a tricycle all the way around Australia to raise money for sufferers of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and did the books of her family's business online at night? And this wasn't an act in isolation. Most of the entrants had worked hard to achieve fulfilling careers, all the while starting families and giving back to the community. What the hell had she done? She made a mental inventory of her achievements. Complete half a degree in agricultural sciences. Coach Bunyip Bay's junior netball team. This was a lot harder than she liked. Look after Dad and Ryan, help them on the farm when they let me. No, nothing else was jumping out at her. Sad. Seriously sad. Faith focused back on Priscilla Morgan Brooks as she spoke about a woman who'd been a few years ahead of her at school. Lara Leeds has taken time off from the law firm where she met her husband Michael to homeschool their 3 children. Somehow, whilst doing this and supporting Michael's demanding career, Lara managed to raise $45,000 last year for research into childhood cancers. Faith joined in the applause while images flashed across a big screen. Photos of Lara's fundraiser in which children with leukemia had illustrated greeting cards, which had then been sold for big bucks across the country. Another finalist had organised an art show for victims of post-traumatic stress. One woman raised almost $30,000 for homeless people by getting Western Australian actors to donate their time and put on a theatre production. Faith recalled reading something about it in the West Australian. And the list went on. Yes, Faith was guilty of serious judgment. If she'd been sitting, she'd have slunk low in her chair in shame. As it was, all she could do was smile and applaud along with the rest of the crowd as Lara Leeds took to the podium to be crowned Ms. Alumna of the Year. While Priscilla Morgan Brooks whisked Lara away to have photos taken with the other finalists, the principal took the microphone once again. "It is with great pleasure," he made elaborate hand gestures, "that I declare our next Ms. Alumna of the Year competition open." He paused for a moment as more applause assaulted Faith's ears, then added, "All old girls who'd like to participate are invited to come forward and pledge this evening." When Faith had arrived that evening, she'd never in her wildest imaginings have envisioned doing what she did next. As she handed her empty glass to a passing waiter, took a deep breath, and went forward to join the other women lining up at the pledge table, she suddenly felt like this was a turning point in her life. This was her year to make a difference. Chapter 2. The next morning, Faith rose with the magpies. All night long, her mind had been churning with ideas. She'd alternated between depressing thoughts of her uninspiring single life and exciting thoughts about the charities she could choose for her fundraising efforts. Breast cancer research, or support for victims' families, seemed the obvious ones, but she wasn't sure obvious was the way to go. Not wanting to wake the Montgomerys, their ancient water pipes made horrendous noises when in use, she skipped a much-wanted shower, tugged on her jeans, a long-sleeved t-shirt and boots, and headed into the kitchen. For as long as she could remember, Monty's parents had offered her a room in the city whenever she visited. She'd always been close to Monty's family, but in the years since her mother's death, Jenny Montgomery and Faith had grown especially close. Jenny called her the daughter they'd never had, which always made Faith smile. Although no one could ever replace her own mum, Jenny had been an amazing support during the hardest time of her life. It had become a habit that whenever she used their hospitality, she made breakfast for them, and today she was more than happy for the occupation. As it was still darkish outside, she flicked on the light and smiled at the immaculate kitchen. Matching blue canisters of tea, sugar and coffee were perfectly aligned on the bench. The pantry was a work of art, tins arranged by size, with their labels all turned to face outwards. This was the way Monty's younger brother liked it, and Jenny and Stuart had adapted in the 25 years since Will was born. Sometimes even Faith forgot that most people didn't find his behaviour normal. William Montgomery was one of the most interesting and intelligent people Faith knew. He was also autistic. "Morning, Faith." At the sound of Jenny's chirpy voice, Faith spun round, the kettle she'd been about to fill swinging in her hand as she greeted her friend. "Good morning." Jenny wore a fluffy dressing gown, even fluffier slippers, and her hair was a bird's nest of white gold. She took the kettle from Faith and leaned over the sink, talking while she turned on the tap and filled it. "You know, it's always so lovely to have you here, but there's no need for you to get up so early and cook for us. You had a late one last night, didn't you?" Faith nodded as she began retrieving ingredients from the pantry. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No, I can't sleep at the moment as it is." Jenny dumped the kettle on the stovetop with a thunk. "Things on my mind." Faith frowned. It wasn't like Jenny to worry. Monty's mum was one of the most easygoing people Faith knew. "Anything I can help with?" she asked. Having located a bowl, she began cracking eggs for her signature breakfast omelettes. "Oh, it's probably nothing." Jenny turned and leaned back against the bench, watching Faith with a forced smile on her face. "I keep having this dream about seeing a raven in my tea leaves." Faith turned her head slightly so Jenny wouldn't see her grin. Monty's mum had a few, how would she put it, quirky interests. Where Monty and his father Stuart were logical in everything they said and did, both keeping up-to-date 5-year plans, Jenny dabbled in numerology, tarot cards, tea leaf reading, and, most recently, flower essences. Faith didn't give much weight to the validity of these things, but she hadn't been around Jenny for most of her life without some of her crazy knowledge rubbing off. "A raven is bad news, right?" "Yes," Jenny replied solemnly. "Very." Picking up the whisk, Faith said, "But you haven't actually had a raven in your tea leaves." "No, just a recurring dream. But you know my thoughts on dreams. They happen for a reason." To an extent, she agreed, but if she didn't believe in tea leaf reading, she could hardly worry about a dream involving them. Racking her mind for something else to talk about, Faith went to retrieve the butter from the fridge. There, stuck on the door with a magnet, was a brochure featuring the cutest puppy ever. "You thinking of getting a dog?" she asked, forgetting she was trying to change the subject, simply smitten by the idea of a new Montgomery pet. "Sorry? Oh, that!" Jenny smiled and took the brochure off the fridge. "Not really. It's from an organisation that trains dogs for autistic children. There wasn't anything around like this when Will was little, and these people," Jenny waved the brochure in the air and then laid it on the kitchen table, "raise dogs to be companions. Will's not a child anymore, but I'm wondering if he might still benefit from us getting a pet." "What about his spiders?" Jenny visibly shuddered as the kettle started whistling behind her. "Something a little more socially acceptable would be ideal. Something that offers greater companionship." Smiling at Will's love of spiders and his mother's absolute disgust, Faith deserted the eggs for a moment and studied the brochure. Dogs for Autism is a non-profit organisation striving to raise, socialise and train autism assistance dogs. These dogs impact many facets of an autistic child's life, including promoting independence, self-esteem, improved psychological well-being and quality of life. Seeing the pricey figure on the page, Faith let out a low whistle. These dogs don't come cheap. "No," Jenny shook her head. "Just like guide dogs for the blind, they need lengthy and dedicated training. But I think it's a great idea, and so wonderful that families have more opportunities like this nowadays." She shrugged. "Just something I'm contemplating. But enough about us. I want to hear the gossip from Bunyip. Gossip? Faith snorted as she went back to her eggs. Gossip was part and parcel of living in a small town where everyone knew everything about everybody, or at least thought they did. Mostly Faith didn't mind, and she didn't usually pay much attention. Her life was so damn boring she guessed nobody ever bothered talking about her, but Jenny still had some good friends in Bunyip Bay and liked to hear about the town whenever Faith or Monty visited. Let's see. The Paynes are selling up and moving to New South Wales to live with their daughter. The new Year 1 teacher had an affair with the principal. Oh, and Monty's started renovating old man Sylvie's place on Annadale Farm, but maybe he's already told you that. Jenny snorted. No, he hasn't. Daniel is far too busy working to talk to his old mum. I had hoped he might come down with you this weekend. Faith bit her lower lip and shrugged apologetically. I did suggest it, but... It's not your fault, Jenny blustered. Anyway, whatever do the Burtons plan on doing with Tom's old cottage? According to Monty, Adam just wants to give Mrs. Burton a project. They might rent it out to holidaymakers one day, but he reckons she's wallowed far too long. Jenny sighed. Adam would be right. I don't blame Esther Burton for pining after her little girl, but it must be almost 20 years since she went missing. It was before we moved down here. She paused for a moment, as if contemplating. Esther needs to remember she has a husband and son worth living for. Not having children herself, Faith found it hard to imagine what it would be like to lose one, but she guessed it wasn't something you'd easily recover from. Most of her memories of the Burton girl were from stories still passed around by the locals. Adam rarely spoke about his sister, but Faith remembered the fuss when she first went missing. The whole town had been involved in the search, but no one had ever found a trace. How is Daniel anyway? Jenny finished making her tea, placed a mug next to Faith, and sat down at the table. Same as ever. Faith found herself holding back a grin as she recalled the way she'd described him to the old girls last night. She'd almost forgotten she didn't have a real boyfriend. He works so hard I rarely see him unless I go along and play his assistant. If he's not at the Burtons, he's out on the boats or helping some farmer or other with a task they'd rather not do themselves. Good to see nothing changes, Jenny mused over the top of her mug, although her tone told Faith she wished it would. Faith watched her egg mixture bubble in the pan. You raised him stubborn. He's got a dream and he won't stop working until he achieves it. Another sigh left Jenny's lips. Stubborn runs in the Montgomery blood, but I'd like him to settle down one of these days. I'd like to have grandchildren while I'm still young enough to enjoy them. And I'd like to have children before menopause, thought Faith. She started and almost burnt her hand on the edge of the frying pan. Where had that come from? At 29, she'd never until 2 seconds ago given one thought to her biological clock. She'd never even been sure she wanted to have children. Had to be all those successful and fertile women she'd been hanging around last night. Had to be all the talk of her successful and good-looking pretend boyfriend. A girl's imagination could get away from her if she let it. I think you might need that puppy as much as Will, Faith said eventually. You know, like a substitute grandchild. Jenny raised one eyebrow. Monty barely stops work long enough to meet eligible women. And anyway, the only one he's shown any interest in recently is Princess Ruby Jones. Princess who? Jenny leaned forward, her eyes dancing with interest. Oh, it's nothing. It's really none of my business. Now don't go giving me that line, Jenny said in her strict mum voice. You wouldn't have said anything if it was nothing. Who is this Ruby? It's the first time I've heard of her. Faith sighed. Ruby is the daughter of Robert and Lynn Jones. They own the ag store. Monty and all the other single guys in town have been vying for her attention since she moved in with her parents a few months back. Really? And why the princess bit? Don't you like her? It's not that, it's just... What had Faith got herself into? Fact was, she didn't know why she'd taken such a dislike to Ruby. She could just be shy, I suppose, but she keeps to herself, and something gives me the impression she thinks she's too good for Bunyip Bay. My guess is she's biding her time until something better comes up and she leaves again, and I don't like the way she's stringing Monty along. Not just a tiny bit jealous, are we? Jenny nudged her. No, there's never been anything like that between us. I see. Well, if she hurts my boy, I'll put a hex on her. Faith laughed. "What's all the ruckus in here?" They looked up to see Stuart Montgomery standing in the doorway, peering at them suspiciously. "Did I miss a good knock-knock or something?" Before either of them could answer, he inhaled deeply, and a massive grin appeared on his bearded face. He eyed the almost cooked omelette in the pan. "Have I ever told you how much I love it when you come to stay?" Stuart crossed the room and draped his arm around Faith's shoulders. "Great to see you again, love." The feeling was absolutely mutual. She leaned into his hug, enjoying the warmth and comfort of his fatherly embrace. How many times recently had she wished Stuart was her real father, and then been overcome with guilt? Stuart and Will had been out yesterday afternoon, some arachnid talk at the museum, when Faith dropped her overnight bag off, but she was glad to see him now. As he sat down at the table opposite his wife, and Faith continued cooking, she found her gaze drifting to the happy couple. Monty's parents had aged well. Despite her quirky dress sense, Jenny was elegant, and Stuart's salt and pepper beard suited him perfectly. She wondered if Monty would be as handsome as his dad at that age. What would he look like with a beard? Shaking that random thought, she laid a couple of omelettes down in front of her friends before turning to start her own. She always enjoyed breakfast with the Montgomerys because they took the time to sit down together. This was something her mum had always insisted on too, but after Cassie's death, the family habit of eating breakfast together had somehow died too. "So, what have you been up to lately, Miss Faith?" Stuart asked, as his fork scraped across his plate. Same old," she replied, glad she didn't have to pretend for these two. "I managed to put the time away running after Dad and Ryan, milking Daisy, keeping the hens. These last two were her mother's projects, things she kept doing because it seemed right. There's also netball coaching, and we'll be starting seeding soon, so I'll no doubt be stuck in the kitchen cooking until some emergency happens and they need me on a tractor." If she sounded bitter, her friends didn't call her on it. But the fact was, the life she'd made up last night was far more appealing than her real one. "Ah, the tractor," Stuart said with a wistful tone. "I do miss that sometimes." Faith couldn't miss the look Jenny shot her husband. "Don't get me wrong, love," he was quick to placate her. "I wouldn't change the past for anyone, and I like living in the city now. But farming was in my blood. Hard to forget it completely." "Of course," Jenny nodded, her expression softening. "Well, if Daniel won't come visit us, we should go to him." "Good idea." Stuart returned to his breakfast. "This is fabulous." "My pleasure." Faith finished cooking her own omelette as the Montgomerys continued digging into theirs. Just as she switched off the gas hot plate, Will strolled into the kitchen. He was wearing neat jeans and a National Geographic t-shirt with a massive redback spider on the front. Faith cringed at the image, but smiled for Will nonetheless. His ash-blonde hair, a shade closer to his mother's than to his father's, was combed back perfectly. He looked a lot like Monty, except Monty never combed his hair. Luckily, the mussed-up look suited him just fine. "Hey, Will." She crossed the kitchen to give him a hug. His response was stiff, but just the fact he now let her hug him made her smile. It had taken a long time and a lot of support to get Will to the functioning adult he was today, but still only those closest to him could get away with something as personally invasive as this. "Hello, Faith." Will extricated himself and crossed to the cupboard. Even though she stayed here only a few times a year, she knew his routine by heart. He'd had the same microwave porridge, the type that comes in a one-serve sachet, for as long as she could remember. He made it himself, waited exactly 1 minute after it was cooked before eating it, then stood immediately to clean away all evidence of his breakfast. In many ways, he was the perfect child, except that he was 25. Giving Will space to make his porridge, Faith took her plate to the table and sighed as she took her first bite. This house was her favourite place in Perth. The Montgomerys were the only people in the city she always made the time to visit. Like Monty, they made her feel special just as she was. When Jenny finished eating, she put her cutlery down and said, "So, Faith, you haven't said much about the dinner." "There's not a whole load to tell," she said, choosing not to mention her pledge to enter the contest just yet. She wanted to give it more thought, work out a charity and game plan first. Mostly it was catching up on who'd married who in the last decade and how many babies had been born. You have no idea how many photos I had to look at. I lost count of the number of times I said, "Oh, isn't she just divine?" Jenny and Stuart laughed, and Faith continued her breakfast, answering a few more questions between mouthfuls, before the conversation waned. "What's new in your world?" she asked her hosts. "I have a job," Will announced as he stood to clean his plate. "That's brilliant," she said, genuinely pleased. "What do you do?" "I work in the library at the university." He positively grinned. "That's awesome." Faith grinned back, fighting happy tears. "You'll be fabulous at that." Not only did Will know the English alphabet back to front, but he could write and speak 7 other languages and tell you the history of each. She'd been 7 or 8 when Will was diagnosed with autism. He was 3 years old and rattled off his alphabet constantly, but wouldn't, or rather couldn't, communicate with his family, never mind anyone else. As Jenny and Stuart did everything they could to learn about Will's condition and enhance his development, they'd travelled back and forth to Perth for treatments and to seek advice from specialists. There wasn't much funding or government assistance available back then, but that didn't stop the Montgomerys doing the best they could. Not wanting to disrupt Monty's schooling too much, they'd left him with the Forresters on many of their city visits. Faith loved having Monty around, but could tell he missed his family more than he let on. Eventually, when the trips and treatments had become too expensive, the distance too much of a hassle, Monty's parents had sold the property that had been in Stuart's family for generations. They packed up their whole life in the back of a budget rental van and moved to Perth. Until then, she and Monty had been inseparable. They'd seen each other almost every day of their lives. She'd taught him how to fish, and he'd taught her how to hold her breath underwater in the dam. Wherever one of them was, the other could usually be found not too far away. Twin terrors, their mothers called them, and Faith had missed her best friend more than anything. Having never been much of a student until then, she'd spent hours after school penning letters to Monty. They barely saw each other until she went to Perth for boarding school 3 years later, but the connection never faded. When she exchanged Bunyip Bay for boarding school, Monty and his family had become a lifeline. Due to distance, Faith couldn't return to the farm most weekends, but Jenny would break her out of boarding house prison, and Faith would do things with the Montgomerys. Movies, Adventure World, trips to the beach. If it was fun, Jenny and Stuart would give it a whirl. Like her, Monty never made many friends at school in Perth, but they were happy with each other's company. Faith wondered if the Montgomerys ever thought about returning to the country now that Will was grown and didn't need as many specialists. Then again, what would such a move achieve? Will was happy and settled in the city. Wasn't that what his parents had spent his whole life working towards? After breakfast, Faith insisted on cleaning up. While Stuart, Jenny and Will went off, the first 2 to dress for the day, the latter to tend his pet spiders, her gaze drifted again to the brochure on the table. As she read about the special dogs, raised, socialised and trained to be companions to children with autism, the ideas started bubbling. She finished the cleaning and headed to the spare room to throw her things into her overnight bag. As much as she'd have loved to spend the day hanging out, she had a long journey ahead. Although it was Sunday, that didn't mean a day of rest for farmers. Ryan and her dad would be expecting dinner when they came in from work. The Montgomerys came out onto the driveway to wave her goodbye. She hugged them all and climbed into her dirty, once white 4-wheel drive. "So we'll see you soon?" she asked through the open car window. Jenny nodded as Stuart wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Definitely," they said in unison. "Tell Daniel to clear out the spare room." They all chuckled, because everyone knew that as hard-working as Monty was, his efforts didn't stretch to housekeeping. Faith made a mental note to clean the room herself. With a final wave, she reversed the car out of the Montgomerys' Bayswater driveway and headed for the highway that would take her north, home to Bunyip Bay. Chapter 3. Faith made good time up the Brand Highway and arrived in Bunyip Bay mid-afternoon. There was plenty of time to make the roast dinner her dad and brother would be expecting, but she wanted to see Monty first. The night before had been surprising in more ways than one, and she wanted to tell him all about it. Besides that, the drive had helped consolidate her choice of charity, and she wanted his opinion. 4.5 hours drive north of Perth, not far south of Geraldton, Bunyip Bay was only a small town, about 2,000 people, but thanks to thriving agricultural and crayfish trades, its population was on the up. City builders were flocking to the region to cope with the housing boom, yet Bunyip Bay still had that small-town vibe that Faith adored. Its people were friendly and down-to-earth, from the farmers to the shopkeepers to the fishermen who practically lived on the jetty, and she loved them all. She smiled as she drove through the familiar town, deserted today except for a few fishermen on the beach, then continued past the turnoff to her family property, heading instead for Annandale, where she knew Monty would be working. She turned into the long gravel drive, past Adam's recently built house, his parents' impressive homestead, and continued on to the old cottage at the far north of the property. Although the land here was much the same as every other farm in the district, there was something eerie about this place, something cold. She and Adam had dated briefly just after she'd left high school, but they'd spent more time at Forrester's Rock than Annandale because, quite frankly, his farm gave her the heebie-jeebies. This was the last place his sister had ever been seen, and Faith could only imagine how painful living here must be for her family. The old cottage came into view, and Faith smiled as she laid eyes on Monty's ute parked out the front. She got out of her vehicle, stretched, and headed up the weed-ridden garden path. Although the yard, fenced with faded old pickets, looked like a jungle, and not a very pretty one at that, she immediately noticed the improvements on the actual building. Last time she'd seen it, the posts along the small veranda had been so rotten they'd been barely holding up the roof, and the exterior walls had looked like they hadn't been painted since 1955. But now everything was shiny and new. Wow! She glanced around as Monty stepped into the open front doorway. And hi! Hi yourself. Monty smiled his typical smile, a cross between bad boy and boy next door, of which he was actually neither. He stepped back and gestured for her to follow him inside. She took in the freshly plastered ceilings and walls as she did so. The floorboards beneath her feet looked beautiful, and the window frames no longer buckled and flaked white paint. A smile stretched across her face at the changes. She'd been inside only once before. Adam's Uncle Tom, known locally as Old Man Sylvie, had lived here until he died, and it had smelled and looked exactly like the man himself, smoky and bespeckled with yellow stains. This is amazing. You going for some kind of speed record, though? Monty shrugged his impressive shoulders and ran a hand through his mussed hair. No, but I've got a few seeding jobs lined up in the next few weeks, and Adam's keen to have it finished so his mum can start the decorating. She nodded. I see. Anyway, while you're here, why not make yourself useful? Sure. Faith tucked her hair behind her ears, ready for whatever he needed her for. Do you need me to help hammer something? His expression deadpan, he said, No, but I'd kill for a cup of coffee. Rolling her eyes, she thumped him hard. He was only ribbing her. Monty knew she hated the way her dad and brother didn't think her good enough for anything more than cooking and housework. My boyfriend doesn't demand I make coffee for him. He lovingly makes it for me, and he brings Tim Tams. Monty screwed up his face in confusion. Sounds like a great guy. When can I meet him? I'm looking at him right now. Faith smiled sweetly as his face contorted even more. Did they put something in your drinks last night? What the hell are you on about, Faith Marie Forrester? She wiggled her eyebrows at him. Do you want the long story or the short, Daniel James Montgomery? He smirked. Something tells me I don't want either. Anyway, I'm almost wrapping up for the day here. Let me do one more thing. He turned and headed farther into the house. While she waited, Faith had a bit of a snoop around. Although being a builder wasn't Monty's lifelong ambition, odd jobs and building were just a means to an end for him, he was a damn fine craftsman. When most school leavers were dead set on partying, Monty had left home and thrown himself into the workforce as soon as he'd graduated. Not fussy about the kind of work he did, he'd returned to Bunyip Bay, bunking on couches in Faith and Adam's houses until he could afford to rent a small place of his own. From that day on, he'd had one goal in mind: to buy himself a farm like the one his parents had sold all those years ago. His skills had been very much sought after, and along the way he'd learned a little about a lot of trades: building, farming and fishing. While friends of theirs went off on Kentucky holidays or bought flashy cars, Monty worked, watching his bank balance grow as he waited for the right place to come onto the market. If only Faith knew what she wanted out of life. She met Monty coming out of the kitchen. Your mum says hi. She asked when you were going to come and visit. He opened his mouth, but she continued over the top of him. Don't worry, I think she's given up waiting. They said they'll come visit you very soon. Monty snorted as they headed back outside. Like that'll ever happen, not with Will. Before she could comment, he offered her a Tupperware container. I don't have any Tim Tams, he announced, gesturing to the front steps, but Mrs. O'Neill brought some Anzacs over the other day. Faith sat down next to him on the top step, the afternoon sea breeze drifting towards them. She peeled back the lid and breathed in the sweet biscuit smell. Is there any old dear in town you don't have wrapped around your little finger? It wasn't really surprising, considering all the odd jobs he did for the local widows. She took a biscuit and passed him the container. He shrugged and swiped a couple for himself. I've stopped counting. So, what's this about a boyfriend? Not any old boyfriend. You. She poked him in the tummy and felt a sting like an electric shock. She snatched her hand back and shook it, her finger tingling. Wowzers, how had she never noticed he had such an impressive six-pack? Despite his height, she'd always thought of Monty as having a lanky, slightly scrawny build, but somehow he'd filled out while she hadn't been looking. Oh boy, had he filled out. Huh? Monty said, looking at her with a bemused expression. What are you talking about? She took a quick breath, tried to forget the muscles. Well, it all began last night at the alumni dinner. You know how you told me I'd regret going? That is, if I didn't die of boredom while there? He nodded. Well, it was actually a fun night in the end. People were really friendly. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to see me again after all these years. So they should be. You're awesome. He bit into an Anzac. Her heart swelled at his compliment. That's why I keep hanging around you, she said. You're good for my ego. It's also why I told the girls that you were the love of my life. Half-chewed oats spurted from Monty's mouth. He quickly recovered, wiping his lips with the back of his hand. You told them what? She was torn between laughing at his reaction and feeling offended. Was the idea that appalling? What's wrong with me? I should be a bloke's dream woman. I like sport, I like Star Wars, I drink beer. Nothing's wrong with you. I've just finished blowing your trumpet. Still, the offers of marriage aren't exactly rolling in. It's just... He stopped for a moment. Oh, never mind. What else happened? She wanted to tell him about the pledge, the contest, her ideas, and about breakfast that morning with his family. But she just twigged what his issue with being her boyfriend was. Oh, Lord, you're worried word will get back to Ruby that we're together. How tragic. He had the good sense to look sheepish. How would that happen? She went to St. Hilda's and moved in totally different social circles than mine. Besides, the girls might have been interested in my love life last night, but they're unlikely to give me a second thought now the party's over. You're safe. A grin erased the look of horror on Monty's face. So what did you say about me? Wouldn't you like to know? Just to irritate him, she turned all her attentions to her biscuit. He was quiet for a moment, chewing on his Anzac. Then his tone turned serious. Does not having a boyfriend really matter that much to you? Faith sighed. To anyone else in the world, she'd laugh off this question. But Monty would see right through her. It matters a bit. He raised his eyebrows. Okay, it matters a lot. I didn't realise it until last night, but... She sighed and tossed the remains of her biscuit to the ants. Don't you get sick of being alone? We're not getting any younger. I want to have a family, don't you? He stared off into the distance. I haven't given much thought to the family bit, but it'd be nice to have someone to come home to. Hopefully when I buy the farm, Ruby will see I'm serious about her, and that I have something worthwhile to offer. Ugh. Faith could no longer hold her tongue. If Ruby can't see how fabulous you are now, if she doesn't want to go out with you when you don't have land to offer, do you really want her when you do? She's not like that. Just because you two don't like the same things doesn't mean she's not a good person. She's offered to help Adam's mum with decorating this place. Of course Monty would think that. He couldn't see the bad in anyone. The way Faith saw it, Adam Burton had land, looks, and a good lifestyle to offer. Ruby probably had her eyes on that. But this wasn't a battle she was going to win, so she decided to let it rest. Anyway, don't stress, she told him. I'm sure Ruby won't hear anything, and when I see the alumni girls next year, I'll say I dumped you or something. By then I won't have to hide behind a mysterious boyfriend because I plan to wow them with me. Monty smiled at Faith. He wasn't really mad at her for pretending he was her boyfriend. He was just annoyed at those stupid women for making her think she wasn't good enough without a husband on her arm. Faith was amazing. She was better than good enough. Instead of reiterating this, he could tell her till the cows came home and she still wouldn't believe him, he clicked the lid back on Mrs. O'Neill's container. The fact she planned to return to another old girls' party surprised him, but it was the wow plan that piqued his interest. "You're going back next year?" "Oh yeah, definitely." Her blue eyes twinkled. "I've pledged to enter the Ms. Alumna of the Year contest." "You've what?" Faith was one shock after another this Arvo. She laughed. "I knew that would be your reaction. Bloody oath, you've moaned about that stupid contest for years." Not only moaned, but flashed the silly alumni newsletter in his face whenever the contest arose, and ranted that she'd never do something like that. "You hated that school, and you hate those women." He watched Faith rub her lips together and saw a new determination in her eyes. Although she still looked the same, in casual clothes that did nothing to accentuate her figure, and with her hair tied in a high but practical ponytail, something was different, as if her night in the city had changed her. "It's hard to explain, but maybe I was wrong about the women who enter the contest." She gazed at the ground. "They're not just the charity queens I condemned them as. They have kids, demanding jobs, and they still make time to raise money for important causes. What do I do?" He opened his mouth, but the first thing that came to mind was that she helped her dad and brother on the farm. That wasn't strictly true. Frank and Ryan treated her like hired house help, and she wouldn't appreciate the reminder. "See?" She all but snarled at his extended silence. "You can't think of anything." And damn it, he hated himself, but he couldn't. What kind of friend was he? "Well, what do you want to do?" "You already know I want to be an equal on the farm, but since that's not going to happen, I've decided to change tack. This is my year. I'm going to make a difference, and I'm going to put some of my needs before Dad and Ryan's." "Good for you." "I'm going to organise the best fundraiser you've ever seen, look into finishing my degree, and damn it, I'm going to get myself a man." Although he laughed at her rah-rah attitude, his chest tightened slightly at this last goal. Of course she'd get married one day, and without a doubt, once one of them committed to someone else, their friendship would change. Faith had always been like a sister to him, but potential partners wouldn't see it that way. "Right. Well, hit me with the fundraising ideas." She grabbed the biscuit container back as if settling in for the long haul. He was about to suggest they migrate into town to the palace when Adam's ute roared up the farm track towards them. Monty smiled, guessing his friend had seen Faith arrive earlier. Adam Burton was as good a bloke as they came. Hard-working, down-to-earth, willing to lend a hand to anyone and anything. Having recently taken the reins on his family's cattle property, he was living Monty's dream. When he leapt out of his ute armed with a six-pack of beers, Faith grinned. "Hey, boys!" Adam waved a hand as he strode up the path. "I'm a girl if you hadn't noticed," Faith shot back. "Oh, I noticed, all right." Monty sometimes wondered whether Adam was still hung up on Faith, even though it was years since they dated. But the one time he'd asked her, she'd shut him down so quickly he hadn't dared to even joke about it again. Adam had dated on and off over the years, but like Monty, he'd never committed to anything serious. Landing beside them, Adam raised his eyebrows and tore 3 beers from the pack. They sighed in unison as they popped the caps and took a first satisfying mouthful. Adam wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and pointed his bottle up at the cottage. "You come to check out Monty's handiwork?" "Not exactly, but that was a bonus. What you guys have done with this place is unreal." Adam grinned. "You should see the plans Mum and Ruby have for the inside. Should have it ready for guests by spring." "So it's going to be some sort of farm stay / B&B?" Faith asked. "Yeah, a country retreat for city folks tired of the rat race." Adam shrugged, his expression turning serious. "But I don't care if we don't get many takers. I really just wanted to give Mum a project to focus on." The 3 of them were quiet for a moment. No doubt Monty's friends were thinking along the same lines as he was, wondering if anything would ever draw Esther Burton out of the black hole she'd submerged herself in when her daughter went missing 2 decades ago. Where Monty's mission was to save enough money to buy his own farm, Adam often seemed ambivalent to life on the land, but wanted desperately to resuscitate his family. Not liking the maudlin mood that had settled, Monty changed the subject. Faith was just about to tell me about a project of her own. Adam looked up. Spill, he instructed as he leaned back against a post. As Faith took a deep breath, a flicker of red flashed across her cheeks, and Monty saw uncertainty in her eyes. Go on, I bet your ideas will be awesome. Okay, so last night I was in Perth for the Perth Ladies College alumni dinner. She quickly gave Adam a rundown of the contest. Having attended an equally elite boys' school, he'd heard of it before. Well, she continued, this year I've decided to organise a fundraiser of my own. A ball to raise money to train companion dogs for autistic kids. Monty stiffened. Growing up with Will, autism had been the focus of near on every conversation in his family. He hated that every time someone mentioned the condition, he got on the defensive. Sounds like fun, Adam said, taking another sip of beer. Monty said nothing. Faith played with her ponytail, twisting it around her fingers. This morning at Monty's parents' house, I saw this brochure about an organisation that trains dogs to help autistic children. Jenny and I were talking about how great one of these dogs would have been for Will, and when I read the brochure, I almost fainted at the cost of them. Not everyone that needs a dog has the money, and they rely on lots of fundraising and donations, so I thought I'd hold a barking ball, barking because of the dogs, as my event. Her hands made excited gestures as she spoke. I'm thinking it'll be like a regular ball in that everyone will dress up, pay an entrance fee, which will likely include dinner and drinks. But I'll also have other things happening on the night. Maybe an auction, raffles, anything else I can come up with between now and then. Where will you hold it? Adam asked. In Perth? Faith shook her head. No, I'm going to try to find somewhere in Bunyip Bay. How often do people up here get to enjoy a flash night out? I know the women in town will love the opportunity to dress up, and I can't wait to see you two in suits. Who said I'd come? Never mind wear a suit. Monty sulked, then immediately regretted it. Faith shot him a look that said, you'll come. And she was right, he probably would. Well, I'm happy to help in any way I can, Adam said. The cause is a great one, especially with Will. I'll think you'll ace it. Thanks, Adam. I'd have thought you'd do something for breast cancer. Monty couldn't keep the accusation out of his tone, but thankfully Faith didn't seem to notice. She rubbed her lips together again, then shrugged one shoulder. I did think about it, obviously. Faith's mum had died of breast cancer not quite 8 years ago now. But breast cancer already gets such fabulous support, she continued. I wanted to choose an organisation in greater need. And it's also for Will. He's had to fight all his life for people to treat him normally. This is my chance to show him how amazing I think he is. Sort of like a tribute. Monty swallowed the lump of unease that had formed in his throat. In that case, like Adam, I'm at your service. He took a theatrical bow and raised his bottle. Let's show them city chicks how we do it in the bush. Chapter 4. Monty yawned. His eyes watered as he stared at his computer, at the bank balances and paperwork laid out across his desk. When Adam's six-pack was gone, his friends had convinced him to head to the local pub. They'd shared a counter meal, and he'd lost count of the number of drinks they'd consumed, although he knew for certain he'd not had half as many as them. Now, while Faith slept it off in the spare room and Adam on the couch, Monty promised himself just one more calculation. He took a much-needed gulp of water from the glass beside him and sighed, trying not to get carried away with the tiny spark of hope inside him. But he couldn't help a small smile. This was it. He was sure of it. After years of working his arse off on other people's farms, then working on the crayfish boats between seasons, he was finally close to achieving his dream. A farm of his own. So close, he could close his eyes and see it, smell it even. The dry but prosperous paddocks, the earthy smells of livestock, the sheds, the dams, maybe even a windmill and a veranda. He grinned and leaned back in his chair, confident that his friends were asleep and wouldn't see him sitting here smiling like a loony. Okay, there was one thing the Paynes property didn't have that he wanted, a veranda right around the homestead, but he was good with his hands. He'd build one. Everything else was perfect. The farm had come on the market a few weeks ago, just when he finally had a deposit that the bank wouldn't sneeze at. It was the right size, had both crops and Australia Suffolk's sheep with which he was familiar, and it was here, only 15 minutes' drive from Bunyip Bay, the place he'd spent his teenage years longing to return to. If he couldn't get back the family farm, he wanted something as close to his childhood memories as possible. A truck screamed past outside, and Monty leaned forward and peered through the curtain. His days of living on the main street of town were over. Soon he'd be back in the peaceful solitude of a farm. Tomorrow he had an appointment with the local bank manager, and he felt like a kid on Christmas Eve. With the deposit he'd saved and his track record of working hard, how could they turn him down? Allowing one last glance over his business plan, he closed the folder and decided it was time to at least try to sleep. He stood, switched off the kitchen light, and headed into the lounge room. He laughed at Adam snoring on the old couch and pulled the curtain shut and the blanket back over him. He didn't envy the headaches his friends would have in the morning, but it had been a fun night. Burning with excitement for her new project, Faith had been happier than he'd seen her in ages. Faith. Once upon a time, sleepovers had involved camping out on their family's lounge room floors, but now they both treasured their sleep and comfort. She was the main reason he had a spare bed, so if they ever had a big night in town, she didn't have to drive back home. She hadn't used it in a while, though. Ryan and Frank seemed to be demanding more and more of her. He grinned again, recalling the text message she'd sent them only a few hours ago, telling them she wouldn't be home in time to make them dinner. Knowing Faith, she had the freezer loaded with emergency dinners, but still. He came to the door of the spare room, which was ajar. He didn't plan to go in, but he noticed her blankets had been tossed right off, and she was groaning in her sleep. Was she having a nightmare? He crept into the room, froze as she made another noise, but then tiptoed towards her when she stopped again. The light from the hall fell across Faith's face. Her forehead was dripping in sweat, but her expression was strangely peaceful. She was far more beautiful than she gave herself credit for. After a brief internal debate about whether or not to wake her, he covered her with a sheet and headed back out. Whether it was a bad dream, the alcohol working its way out of her system, or something else entirely, hopefully it'd be gone by morning. At the buzzing of the alarm on her mobile, Faith rolled over and instinctively stretched out to quieten the blasted thing. When her hand met nothing but air and then thumped down against the side of the bed, she blinked her eyes open. Memories from the previous day flooded her mind, setting off a headache that had been lying in wait for her to wake up so it could announce itself as a hangover. Why, oh why, had she let herself talk Monty and Adam into a big night out on a Sunday? All but falling out of bed, she stumbled across the room to her backpack and rummaged for her phone. The barking dog was not at all kind to her throbbing head. Oh, Lord. Groaning, she located her boots on the floor and tugged them over the socks she'd been too exhausted to take off last night. She couldn't wait to get home, into a shower and fresh clothes. After stuffing everything into her bag, she made the bed and headed into the kitchen in search of a glass of water. Good morning. Monty's far too chirpy voice slammed into her senses, sparking a flashback to a dream she'd had last night. A dream she hadn't even remembered until this second. Oh, sheesh. Her cheeks suddenly hot, Faith excised that memory from her mind and opened her mouth to snipe at Monty, but her jaw locked open at the sight before her. She swallowed, her gaze drawn to her friend's bare chest, definitely as tanned as she'd told the alumni girls, and the navy blue track pants on his legs. It was autumn, for crying out loud. Why didn't he put on more clothes? As she took in his damp hair and the glisten of newly showered skin on his fabulous builder's shoulders, the rest of the dream came barreling back. And she couldn't believe what it had involved. She wanted to slam her hands over her eyes, then order Monty to go and put a shirt on. She'd seen him like this before. Hell, they'd taken baths together as kids, and even skinny dipped at the beach one time. And she'd never been remotely affected, so such a request was out of the question. He'd want to know why she suddenly had a problem with bare skin. Breakfast? He asked, turning to open an overhead cupboard. She finally noticed the smell of bacon and the sizzle of the frying pan, but her stomach churned at the thought of putting any food into her mouth. No thanks. Trying to sound normal, she averted her gaze from Monty's sculpted back and took a quick breath. I'd better get back to the farm. They'll be worried about me. More like worried she wouldn't have lunch on the table. Okay. Yes. All right. She licked her lips, which felt parched. Had to be the effect of the alcohol. I'll just grab a glass of water and be off. Before she could source a glass, Monty handed her a full one. In his other hand, he proffered a tube of Barocca. Want one of these too? No, thanks. The Barocca would take too long to fizz, but she smiled, her nerves settling at Monty's normalness. He'd always looked out for her. She adjusted her backpack on her shoulder and waved. Thanks for the bed. I'll see you later. Wait a sec. Monty turned away from his cooking and held his arms wide open. Aren't you going to wish me luck for today? She stilled, racking her brain for why he needed luck. All the while, her crazy errant nerve ends dancing the cha-cha at the thought of falling into his arms. How much did I drink last night? He shook his head, laughed a little. Geez, your head must be bounding. You can't remember what's happening today? Sorry. She rubbed her forehead. Clue? He snorted, but she detected genuine hurt behind feigned humour. I've got my appointment with the bank. Oh, goddamn! She wanted to smack herself up the side of her head. Instead, she rushed forward and fulfilled her half of the hug. Of course, I knew that. Pulling back, she looked into his eyes. How do you feel? Good. I was up late going over my paperwork, but I'm in a good position and my calculations look positive. Of course they do. You're awesome, she said, smiling as she repeated his words of the day before. I want this so badly, Faith. The expression on his face said it all. I know you do. You think a suit and tie is going over the top? She shook her head. No, you want to look like you mean business. Do you want me to go with you? No, but thanks. I've been working towards this for 10 years. I can do it. A lump formed in Faith's throat at Monty's steely determination. She hugged him again so he wouldn't notice her getting all girly and tearing up. Go get him, buddy. Am I interrupting anything? Adam's voice startled Faith. She'd forgotten he'd also stayed the night. No, of course not, Monty said over the top of her head. Just wishing Monty luck for his appointment. She pulled out of his arms and spun around. Like Monty, Adam wore only trousers, faded Wrangler jeans in his case, and he had shower-damp hair too. But Faith's heart didn't threaten cardiac arrest at the sight of him bare-chested, which meant the alcohol wasn't to blame for her reaction. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, the big bank meeting. Adam nodded. You'll be great. Monty grinned. Thanks, mate. Can I get you some breakfast before you go? Yes, please. Patting his six-pack abs, Adam crossed the room and bent down to his bag on the floor. He pulled out a T-shirt, yanked it over his head, and took a chair. Faith stared at him, desperate to feel something at the sight of his upper arm muscles contracting as he reached across the table for yesterday's Sunday Times. But nothing. Absolutely nothing. That had also been the problem 10 years ago when she and Adam had attempted a relationship. On the surface, Adam was a good-looking guy. So good-looking, in fact, that he'd once been hunted by Clio magazine to be one of their Bachelors of the Year. But where he and Faith were concerned, there was absolutely no spark. Their breakup had been a mutual decision. Maybe that's why her fluttery libido didn't react to his near-nakedness now. Prior knowledge overruled good looks. But that didn't account for why her knees were suddenly knocking at the sight of Monty. It had to be because she'd told all those women she was dating him. See what kind of trouble came of lying? Oh, I've got to get out of here. Hopefully, once her head was clear and the alumni party faded to a distant memory, she'd be able to look at Monty again, clothed or not, without getting all hot under the collar. Faith? Monty's concerned voice jolted her from her reverie. Are you okay? Sure, why wouldn't I be? It was like you were in a trance or something, Adam said as he poured himself a mug of coffee. Nope. She forced a smile. I'm absolutely fine. Just thinking of all I need to get done today. I'll see you guys soon. Normally she'd have pecked each of them on the cheek, but today she decided it might be safer not to. Holding her backpack up onto her shoulder again, she took 2 steps backwards out of the kitchen and all but ran from the house. This is the end of CD 1. The book continues on CD 2. CD 2. Chapter 5. When Faith walked into the house at Forrester's Rock 15 minutes later, she'd have been forgiven for thinking a tornado had whirled through over the weekend. Her dad and brother were nowhere to be seen, but they'd left their mark in every nook and cranny. On the way from the front door through to her bedroom, she began Operation Cleanup, stooping to collect empty soft drink cans, Mars bar wrappers, and socks that were so far gone they should have been incinerated. As she tossed all her loot in the kitchen bin, her heart rate accelerated for reasons entirely different from why it had spiked in Monty's house. Dishes were piled skyscraper high in the sink, and the cereal bowls were still on the table. She flung her backpack on the floor, shoved her sleeves up to her elbows, and turned the tap on full blast. Who do they think I am? Cinder Bloody Rella? It hadn't always been this way. When her mum was alive, they'd all been expected to pull their weight, but somehow, in the months after she'd died, the routine of helping each other had slowly slipped beyond repair. Faith had become the go-to girl for cooking and cleaning. The cooking she actually enjoyed, but no one liked being treated like a slave. When the sink was full of soapy water, she clicked her iPod into the dock in the lounge room and switched it to shuffle. Cleaning could be almost bearable with her favourite tunes turned up loud, and she hoped today they'd help drown out her grumpiness. As she washed the dishes and polished the kitchen so it sparkled, while she ran the vacuum cleaner around the house, opened the windows to air the joint, threw a load of washing on and mopped the hard floors, she vowed that her home life was going to change. There. 3 hours later, hands on her hips, she stood back and assessed her work. The house looked fabulous, and she felt good about what she'd achieved, but knowing her housemates would barely notice, never mind thank her, dampened the joy. She'd tried not to think too much about Monty while she'd worked, but now she glanced at her watch. It was almost midday, which accounted for the racket her empty belly was making, and his appointment was scheduled for just after lunch. She bit her lip, hoping like crazy he got the loan. The vacuum and other cleaning supplies tucked away in the laundry, Faith headed for the fridge. She pulled a loaf of bread out of the freezer and was about to defrost the lot for sandwiches when she thought again. Already anticipating the look on her dad and Ryan's faces, she smiled and proceeded to make herself the best darn sandwich ever. She grated every type of vegetable she could find, sliced some ham and cheese, and then threw it all together to form something she probably wouldn't be able to get her mouth around. She set her lunch on a plate, grabbed a can of Coke from the fridge, and laid them both on the table before quickly tidying her mess. At the last moment, just before her bum landed on the chair, she decided she wouldn't throw them totally in the deep end. Retrieving the still mostly frozen loaf of bread, the margarine, the ham and cheese, she put them in a row on the bench. There, let them make their own gourmet lunch. As she sat and took the first mouth-watering bite, she contemplated her fundraising pledge. She'd need to talk to the Shire about using the Memorial Hall, or maybe someone's shearing shed would work better. Then there'd be sponsors to solicit, catering to organise, tickets to print, invitations, prizes. Everyone loved prizes at things like this. Decorations. And she should contact the charity soon and discuss her plans with them, not to mention set a date. Her mind whirled with ideas. Not wanting to forget a single one, she left her sandwich and went to the study, where she located an old roll of butcher's paper that had been there since she and Ryan were kids and liked to scribble away rainy afternoons. She ripped off a poster-size piece, dug for markers in the bottom of a drawer, and carried it all back to the kitchen table. It felt good to finally have something to sink her teeth into. Something productive that would have positive effects well beyond the realms of Forrester's Rock. She was deep into an impressive mind map of every area that needed to be organised when the front door slammed and boots pounded down the hallway towards her. Cringing, she imagined the mud marks on her clean floors. "Once upon a time you guys took your boots off on the veranda," she yelled, and then sighed under her breath. Once upon a time a lot of things were different around here. Ryan appeared in the doorway, grinned the smile that let him get away with anything and everything with the ladies, and said, "And then what would you do with your time?" Faith tightened her grip on a thick, black marker, restraining herself from throwing it at him. She knew he didn't mean any harm, but she was sick of being taken for granted. "Nice of you to join us again," Ryan continued, crossing the floor and pulling out a chair. "How was Perth?" Before Faith had a chance to answer, her father entered the kitchen. He took one look at her chart on the table and frowned. "Where's lunch?" She gestured to the bench where the basic ingredients for a sandwich were laid out. "Right there, Dad." Daringly, she took a bite of her own barely touched lunch and waited. Frank raised his eyebrows. Ryan turned his head, and his eyes widened as he took in the spread of ingredients. Both of them appeared speechless. Hiding her smirk behind her sandwich, Faith took another bite. "You expect us to make it?" Ryan finally asked. Keeping a straight face, she nodded. "I've been quite busy this morning, but it's all there, ready to throw together." Shaking his head, Ryan made a noise. She wasn't sure whether it was amusement or annoyance. But then he washed his hands and started assembling bread and cheese. Her dad, however, turned his glare on her. "Is something wrong?" "Actually, it's never been better. I had an awesome weekend in Perth, and I've decided it's time to do something important with my life. To start with, I'm organising a big ball in town to fundraise for dogs for autistic kids. Kids like Will Montgomery was." She'd added that last bit because she knew they both had a soft spot for Monty's brother. Silence reigned until Ryan scraped a chair across the tiles as he sat down. He wrapped his mouth around a chunky cheese sandwich made with still frozen bread and winced as he bit in, then looked at her as if she'd changed into an alligator right before his eyes. "And how much time will this fundraising malarkey take up?" grunted her dad. "Are we going to be expected to make our own lunch every day? What about dinner?" She swallowed. Thinking about standing up for herself was one thing, but actually doing so... "Well?" Frank spoke calmly, but there was thunder in his eyes. "Sometimes," she nodded, garnering courage, "and I don't think it's too much to ask. I never asked to be a slave to you two, but somehow that's what I've become. My life is slipping away while I cook scones and stews and God knows what else for you. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm taking it back. If you won't let me take on some actual farm work, then I'm going to look for something else, a job outside of Forrester's Rock." Frank and Ryan gaped at her. Needing to fill the silence, she continued. "Just think about it. If you respected my wishes to be part of this place, then I might be too busy to look elsewhere. But I'm not. I'm bored, senseless. Mum may have done everything for you, but I'm fed up. You need to learn how to look after yourselves." Tears pooling at the corners of her eyes, Faith gathered up her piece of paper and her pens and stormed to her bedroom. She let the things in her arms fall to the floor, then collapsed onto the bed as the tears spilled freely. How unfair that she should be made to feel guilty for doing something for herself. She rolled over and stared at the photo of her gorgeous mum on her bedside table. In many ways, Faith looked like Cassie, although her mum had always managed to seem more glamorous. One of those farmers' wives who could make checked shirts, Levi's and cowboy boots look feminine. Cassie rarely wore blundies, preferring to order her boots from a catalogue, where she could get a bit of style, as she put it. Faith sighed. "Did you ever feel like this, Mum?" Maybe she had. Maybe that's why she'd been so gung-ho about Faith studying something other than agricultural sciences. Maybe she'd wanted more for her than to end up a farmer's wife. Damn it, why hadn't she listened? And damn it, why did you have to go and get sick? Of course, there was no answer to this question, and before Faith could remember this, a knock sounded on her bedroom door. Ryan didn't wait for her to reply, but the look of concern she saw on his face surprised her. "You okay, sis?" He hung back awkwardly in the doorway. "Dad's gone back out to work, but I wanted to check on you first. I'm sorry if we've been jerks. We didn't think." She didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or throw something at him. Maybe the trifecta. How many times have I asked if I could help with seeding or harvest, help muster sheep, fill water tanks. How many times? Ryan looked confused. Dad pays you well enough, doesn't he? Faith felt a quick stab of guilt, because yes, he did pay her reasonably well, but it's not about the money. I want to do more with my life than house duties, milking and collecting eggs. Right. Ryan scratched his head like a confused puppy, and then came to sit down beside her. So, what do you want to do? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? For as long as Faith could remember, she'd assumed she'd work the land. It was why she'd ignored Cassie's plea that she'd do something like teaching or nursing, or even PR at uni, and gone to ag school instead. She'd loved being at Muresk, being one of the blokes, working hard, getting dirty, drinking hard too. She loved being outdoors, could even remember a time when her father used to let her ride in the tractor with him during harvest or seeding. She couldn't imagine any other life. Faith sat up slightly and hugged a pillow to her chest. When Cassie was diagnosed with cancer, the world had shifted. She'd been summoned home with only 6 months of her degree to go. Not that she'd wanted to be anywhere else, but she'd had to grow up fast. By that time, her mother was already a tiny shell of the woman she'd been. It was heartbreaking. She'd fought the cancer courageously at first, going through chemotherapy and every alternative therapy under the sun, but once the disease finally took hold, she stayed close to home. None of them had liked the idea of Cassie spending her last days in a hospice, so Faith had nursed her at Forrester's Rock till the end. She'd been there when her mother had taken her last breath, and somehow that had made the pain easier to deal with. She'd always been grateful for those months together. They'd talked about everything under the sun, laughed and cried as they'd reminisced about the past and spoken about a future only Faith would have. Cassie had never once complained, and Faith tried to remember that now, when things in her life sucked. At least she had life. But losing her mum wasn't the only thing that had changed. In many ways she felt like she'd lost her father too. In the years since her mum had died, Frank Forrester had become less and less communicative. He had busied himself on the farm, as if trying to outrun the memory of losing his wife. Somehow, after the first few weeks, they'd never spoken about Cassie's death. In the beginning, Faith and Ryan had allowed him his silent misery because that was easier to put up with than talk about their mother. But now it was too late. He'd become distant and angry, someone she no longer felt she knew at all. Ryan was still a larrikin, but sadness had left its mark on him too. Sis, tell me. Lost in her thoughts, she'd almost forgotten he was there. She felt his hand on the small of her back. When was the last time he'd reached out to her? She swallowed. I want to be an equal on the farm, to work alongside you both. And if that's not possible, then I want you to honestly tell me and to let me go. I'll finish my degree and find a job that lets me use it. But I just can't go on like this. I'm more at home in a paddock than a kitchen. I don't know, Ryan said with a small grin. I think you do a pretty awesome job in both. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around one of Ryan's hands. She'd taught herself to cook when she'd needed to, and had come to quite enjoy it, but baking was only fun when she didn't have to do it. Thanks for listening. I didn't realize how trapped I was feeling until this weekend, but you have to know I'm serious about this. I can't just sit back and let you guys walk all over me anymore. Ryan winced. Geez, have we been that bad? She nodded. But it's as much my fault as yours. Like you said, I never made enough noise about being dissatisfied. I just let the resentment fester. Although she'd whinged and complained to Monty, she'd never confronted her family until today. Do you want to come out with me now? I could use a hand with the sheep. Ty's getting a bit old and crotchety for the job. You're offering me your dog's job? She quirked an eyebrow at him. Oh, damn it, I'm trying to offer an olive branch here. I know, relax. She wiped the back of her hand against her eyes, feeling so much better after chatting with him. But I've got plenty to do this arvo, and I don't know if Dad's going to be quite so forgiving. He'll come round. I'll talk to him, promise. Ryan ruffled her hair and she whacked him one, but not hard, because inwardly she was very grateful that Ryan had sought her out and sympathised. Thanks, bro. And because I'm feeling generous, I'll make dinner tonight, but you'll have to do the washing up. Ryan shook his head as if he couldn't believe she'd even suggest such a thing, but she caught the twinkle in his eyes and threw a pillow at his back as he heaved himself off the bed and fled out the door. Monty left his meeting with the local bank manager feeling as if there was no obstacle he couldn't conquer. The moment he reached his ute, he dug his mobile phone out of his pocket and dialed Faith. "How'd you go?" she asked by way of a greeting. He grinned. "Mr. Spencer has to send my paperwork to head office, but he's confident I'll have pre-approval as early as Friday." Faith whooped down the line. When she stopped squealing as he brought the phone back to his ear, he said, "I've done it. Dreams really can come true if you work hard enough." "So what's the next step?" "I've been talking to the real estate agent handling the Payne property. I'm going to call him in a moment and tell him it's looking good." "Oh, I'm so excited for you. I won't be able to concentrate on anything else for the rest of the day." He laughed. "I know that feeling. Think I'm going to take the Arvo off and go fishing." "You what?" Shock radiated through her words. "I know, crazy, eh?" He couldn't recall the last full day he'd had off work. Even Sundays weren't a day of rest in his world. "Want to come?" "Do I ever?" But then she sighed. "Better give it a miss today, though. I just had a run-in with Dad and I want to be around when he comes home to smooth things over. Rain check?" "Sure." He bit down on the disappointment. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, fine. Ryan and I had a really good chat, actually. But I've kind of given Dad an ultimatum, and I don't think he expected it. I told him things have got to change, and that I want more real responsibility on the farm." "Good for you. It's been a long time coming." "Sorry about the fishing, but let's celebrate when the loan's official. What do you say?" "I say great minds think alike. How about a get-together at the pub Friday? You in?" "Yes, definitely." He climbed into his ute and slipped the key in the ignition. "I'm going to ask Adam, a few mates from the boats, Curtis, Ruby, Kyle, and anyone else he can think of." "Can I bring Ryan?" Yeah, if you want." That surprised him. Ryan often came to the pub, but he tended to favour backpackers to locals when it came to company. She laughed. "I'll talk to you before then, but it's a date." When Faith disconnected the call, Monty smiled. Victory. He'd mentioned Ruby without Faith getting her claws out. He hoped that if Ruby agreed to go out with him, Faith would give her a chance. He wanted the women in his life to get along, and was damned if he knew why Faith had it in for her anyway. Speaking of the women in his life, it was about time he called his mum. A twinge of guilt pricked his heart. Not calling her for weeks hadn't been intentional, but life had been busy, and he hadn't really had anything worth reporting. Now he could phone her and give her something to make her smile. He pulled up his contact list and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring. "Daniel!" As if he was the prodigal son and she hadn't seen him for years. "Hi, Mum." "How are you?" It wasn't the standard "how are you" people exchanged in the street. It was a mother's "I want to know everything" question. "Fine." He paused for a moment and gave his head a quick shake. "No, I'm much better than that. I saw a bank manager today and it looks like I'm going to get a loan. I'm going to make an offer on the Payne farm." "Oh, Daniel." She sniffed, but it was a joyous sound. "I'm so happy for you." "Thanks, Mum." He shifted in his seat, hoping she wasn't going to get too emotional on him. "Have you got time to talk, sweetheart? I want every detail." So Monty leaned back in the seat of his ute, wound down the window, and told his mum all about his plans for the new place. They talked for over an hour, and he felt closer to her than he had in a long time. Finally, he asked after Will. "He's going great, honey." Her voice was so animated, so full of joy. "He's come on in leaps and bounds lately. Did Faith tell you he's got himself a job? And there's even a girl he's a bit keen on. I'm so proud of you both." "Wow." Monty tried to wrap his head around the idea of Will achieving these things. He'd always been bright, probably 10 times brighter than Monty, but his disorder had held him back, stopped him achieving at the level other people of his intellect might. "Tell him I said hi," he said, feeling another twinge of guilt that he rarely made the effort to call Will. You could visit and tell him yourself, she replied. Or we could come up one weekend. He didn't go home often. Mostly he was busy with work. He hated turning down jobs, and when you made yourself available 24/7, you could be occupied all the time. But that wasn't his only reason for avoiding his family. It's not really a good time, Mum. Seeding's starting soon. He loved his brother, but Will wasn't the type of person you could get close to. No one knew how hard it had been, being the normal son in the family. That and the fact that Will had taken up so much of their parents' time and been the reason for selling the farm had always made Monty resent him slightly. So many times he'd wished he felt differently, and he knew that if he ever told anyone he'd sound like a monster. So instead, as usual, he made an excuse. Look, I promise I'll visit more when I'm settled in my own place. That would be good, sweetheart. Chapter 6. As the sound of a barking dog filled her room, Faith sat up in bed, so hot and sweaty her pyjamas were soaked. She laid one hand against her wildly beating heart as she let out a slow breath and picked up her phone with the other hand. She shut off the noise and fell back against her pillow. All week, the same dream, over and over again. Monty. You'd think all the work and planning she was doing on the barking ball, not to mention the stress over the fallout with her father, would have left her too tired for dreaming. But she'd never dreamt so much in her life. And she'd certainly never had those kinds of dreams about her best friend. She'd never even thought about Monty in a romantic fashion, and he'd given no indication of ever thinking of her that way either. She didn't want to feel attracted to Monty. Their friendship was far too precious, and they shared too much history to risk it for something that might be a total and utter fizzer, because that was her fear. She might be able to dream red-hot sex, but so far she'd never been able to achieve it. And if she kissed him and it wasn't good, if she even told him about the feelings she'd been having, it would be too late to turn back. She'd not only jeopardize her most important friendship, she'd risk her bond with his family too. How could she even contemplate the idea? Noise of Ryan and her dad shuffling through the house, showering, opening and shutting wardrobe doors, jogged her into motion. Despite her logical thoughts, she felt somewhat robbed to be pulled from such a dream. One quick swipe of her pyjama-covered arm against her sweaty brow, and she threw back the covers. Pushing thoughts of Monty aside, Faith shoved her feet into her Uggies and ventured into the kitchen. She found Ryan leaning against the bench, waiting for the kettle, which was just starting to whistle on the stove. "Morning, Sleeping Beauty, good rest?" he asked as he lifted the old iron kettle. Heat rushed to her cheeks as she wondered if he could read her mind. Don't be ridiculous, she told herself. He's barely in touch with his own emotions, no way he can read yours. She forced a smile. Yeah, great, thanks. You? All right. Want a cuppa? Thanks. And in return, would you like bacon and eggs? Cooking would take her mind off its nocturnal hang-up. What's the catch? Ryan joked. Faith laughed and set to gathering her ingredients. Ryan had been making a real effort since their chat on Monday. That effort hadn't yet stretched to cooking, but he'd washed the dishes every night and even done a load of midweek washing. Unfortunately, she couldn't say the same for her father. They'd all been treading on eggshells for years, but after her little announcement, things had moved from uncomfortable to impossible. As if her thoughts summoned him, Frank Forrester lumbered into the kitchen, wearing his farmer's uniform of jeans and a blue chambray shirt, both of which had seen better days. Morning, Dad. Faith attempted a ceasefire smile, but couldn't help glancing down at his feet already encased in dusty old boots. He caught her looking and scowled. Don't know why you care about boots in the house when you've gone on a cleaning strike anyway. She opened her mouth to tell him she hadn't gone on a cleaning strike, not even close, but closed it again. Anything she said would only rile him up. Why couldn't the man be reasonable for 5 seconds? She hated that the only time they came close to having a conversation, they fought. Deciding it was safer to just bite her tongue, she blinked away the threatening tears and turned back to the task at hand. Without asking her father, she cooked him breakfast as well, but by the time she'd served their plates high with fried eggs and bacon, she'd lost her appetite. Once upon a time, her daddy had adored her, but it seemed those days were over. If things didn't get better between them soon, she'd be forced to leave, whether she found another job or not. After I've tidied the house, milked Daisy, done some washing and collected the eggs, this for Frank's sake, to show she hadn't completely turned her back on them, I'm going into town to the post office and to run some errands. Either of you need anything while I'm there? She only looked at Ryan, unable to bear the wrath in her dad's eyes. A girl could take only so much hostility. "More Coke, please. I drank the last can last night," Ryan said. Frank said nothing. She nodded and started to clean up. A few moments of silence later, Ryan spoke again. "Are we still on for tonight?" "Yes, definitely." Despite the weird dreams about Monty, Faith had been looking forward to this night out all week. It sounded as if he'd invited every guy within a 100-kilometre radius, and she planned to be prepared. She'd decided on an all-over overhaul. How would men ever take her femininity seriously if she kept dressing like one of the boys? After an evening spent virtual window shopping, she'd ordered some new clothes from an online fashion store that promised speedy delivery. She was desperately hoping they'd turn up at the post office today. "Earth to Faith," Ryan's words caught her off guard. Before she could answer, her dad griped again. "Don't expect to get a sensible word out of her. She's too busy thinking up airy-fairy plans. Some of us have real jobs to do." Leaving his empty plate in front of him, Frank pushed his seat away from the table and stormed out of the kitchen and down the hall. Faith looked to Ryan. "So I guess your talking to him hasn't worked yet?" Ryan sighed and shook his head. "No, he wouldn't even let me broach the subject. But he'll come round. He just doesn't know how to handle this new stand-up-for-herself Faith. Personally, I like her." With those parting words, Ryan gave her an unexpected hug, swiped the last piece of bacon off his plate, and followed their father. Faith cleaned the kitchen on autopilot before heading into town. As she turned her four-wheel drive into the main street, she waved at a couple of people as they drove past. A trip to town was never quick. There was always someone or other to catch up with, but that was part of the appeal. She parked outside the post office, desperate to see if her new clothes had arrived, and also if Dogs for Autism had sent the information she'd requested. She scored on both counts and tried not to jiggle too much with excitement as she carried her packages back to the car. The fundraiser information excited her, but it was the box from the clothing company that really roused her interest. Using her car key, she sliced through the outer packaging and gasped at the material inside. Eek, had she gone over the top? She couldn't remember the last time she'd worn an actual dress. She hadn't even worn one to her Year 12 formal, instead causing a stir by turning up in a manly tuxedo. There were a couple of photos of her as a toddler wearing pretty sundresses, but her mum had soon learnt there wasn't much point in putting Faith in such clothes. For someone whose usual wardrobe consisted of jeans and a t-shirt, the magenta cocktail dress freaked her a little. Ordering it was one thing, but could she really wear it at the local pub? Her stomach flipped at the thought. She could imagine the widened eyes of the locals as she marched across to the bar wearing this scrap of material and the boots she'd bought for the alumni party. The thought overwhelmed her for only a moment, before she realised that was exactly the type of reaction she was hoping for. Lord knew the reaction she'd been getting for the last 10 years wasn't doing her any favours. Faith closed the lid and put the box aside. She couldn't wait to get home and try on the dress. But first her errands: Ryan's Coke, some items to restock their pantry, the Farmer's Weekly for her dad, and a stop-in at the visitor centre to find info on local artists who might like to donate to the auction she planned to have at the ball. Between the IGA and the visitor centre, Faith's gaze caught on the window of the hairdressers. She paused and peered inside. Charlene, the owner of the salon, stood at the counter, aimlessly flicking through magazines. Not a soul was in the shop, which was strange for a Friday, but maybe it was a sign. Maybe it was fate. With her free hand, Faith twisted her ponytail round her fingers. Her mousy brown hair, so thick and long it wasn't ever practical to do anything but tie it up, induced a sigh. Faith? She hadn't noticed the salon door open, but she looked up to see Charlene staring curiously at her. Can I help you? Yes, definitely. A new hairdo would be the perfect complement to the magenta dress. If she was going to change, she didn't want to do it by half. "Do you have time for an appointment?" Charlene's eyes glistened. "What do you want done?" Faith grinned. "Absolutely everything." It was early, but the music was already rocking at the palace, and Monty felt his heart rocking right alongside it. He'd heard that afternoon that his loan had been approved, and he'd instructed Mac, the real estate agent, to take his offer to the Paynes. Eager to start the celebrating, he'd arrived a good half-hour early. He sat at the bar, tapping his boots along to the country music belting out from the stereo and chatting to Liam, the publican, when he wasn't serving his few customers. Currently, the only people in the pub were a local family with 3 young kids having an early counter meal and 2 old men who spent more time here than they did at home. A shadow fell behind him, then a hand clapped firmly against his back. "What are you having, mate?" came Adam's jovial voice. "The drinks are on me tonight. Well, at least the first few anyway." "I thought farmers were supposed to be hard up," Liam said, as he pulled a couple of pint glasses down from a shelf. Adam laughed. "We are, but we know how to prioritise, right, Monty?" Monty managed to open his mouth, but his throat was so clogged up with emotion he almost couldn't speak. He took a moment, and then let out a short, "Yeah, a farmer. After all these years." When their beers landed on the bar, Adam raised his for a toast. "Welcome to my world. Dumb sheep, no rain, and long hours on a tractor." As they drank to this, the pub door swung open. Monty turned, hoping to see Ruby. He'd asked her to join them when he'd popped into the ag store for some supplies on Wednesday, but she hadn't given him a definite answer. Nevertheless, her response, "I'll try," had kept him on a high since. His shoulders slumped as a horde of guys he'd worked with on the crayfish boat spilled into the pub. He was happy to see them, and would probably miss them when they weren't colleagues anymore, but they weren't Ruby. There was just something about Robert and Lynn Jones's daughter that had captured his attentions. Okay, and the attentions of all the other single blokes in Bunyip, the moment she'd moved to town. Although she had the looks of a supermodel, she kept pretty much to herself. He'd asked her out a few times before, and she'd politely declined, but Monty wasn't one to give up when he wanted something. "Monty, my main man!" A lanky bloke who didn't look like he could lift one crayfish, never mind a whole crate of them, slapped Monty on the back. "Hey, Curtis," he said with a grin. The other blokes offered their congratulations and voiced their disappointment that Monty wouldn't be working with them anymore. They settled down to a round of drinks. Then Kyle, coming back from his first trip to the men's room, froze. Staring ogle-eyed at the pub entrance, he finally let out a wolf whistle. Everyone swung round to see what, or rather who, had got Kyle's balls in a twist. Monty's mouth was the first to drop open. Faith. Her smile filled her whole face as his gaze met hers. His mouth went dry. Ryan came in behind her and they started towards the bar. She strode like she'd been walking in knee-high F-me boots her whole damn life. A titillating pink dress fell way above her knees, showcasing legs that usually only wore jeans or denim shorts. And her hair. What had she done with her hair? It swished around her shoulders as she sashayed toward them. It looked so soft, silky and golden blonde, a few shades lighter than usual. His fingers twitched around his beer glass as the craziest thought of sliding them through Faith's hair hit him like a sucker punch to the gut. Before he could digest this thought and work out what the hell to do with it, Ryan and Faith were amongst them. Adam lifted a hand in greeting, and Faith grinned at her audience of open-mouthed men. "Evening, boys?" The look on his mates' faces reminded Monty his own jaw was still scraping the ugly carpeted floor, and he picked it up quick-fast. While the guys fell all over each other trying to win the honour of buying Faith's first drink, Monty sidled up beside her. "Do I know you?" Typical Faith style, she socked him in the arm. He rubbed at the spot, pretending she'd bruised him. "Hey, just saying. You look different tonight." "Different, huh? You sure know how to compliment a girl." Shaking the shocking thoughts that were really circling his head, he raised his eyebrows. "All right, you look amazing. Is that better?" When did you get your hair done? This morning. Lifting fingers which were covered in pink nail polish she'd previously thought alien to Faith, she ran them through the ends of her hair. You like? Yes. He grinned, then leaned in close. I think every bloke in the pub likes. Good. Then my mission is half accomplished. What's the rest of the mission? She wriggled her eyebrows at him and hissed in his ear, to get one of them to ask me back to his place. A muscle at the side of his neck twinged as he thought about the prospect of one of the guys taking Faith home. Yes, they were all mates, but were any of them good enough for her? Would they respect her, treat her right? Or would they simply take advantage of her current mental state? You don't know what to say, do you? Faith was clearly amused. That wasn't strictly true. He wanted to tell her to be careful, that the way she looked now made her a danger to herself in a room full of red-blooded males. Sure I do. I was just thinking about which of these blokes could actually handle you. Don't you worry your pretty little head. She waved her index finger in front of his nose. I'll be the judge of that. With that promise, she turned on her impressive heels and entered the circle of men waiting with drinks. Within seconds, someone had given her a glass of wine, but it looked out of place in her grasp, considering her usual drink of choice was beer. So, Faith, Curtis said, leaning much closer than was necessary, Adam's been telling us about this big ball you're organising. Where do we get tickets? Monty rolled his eyes. Since when had any of his crayfishing mates been interested in dancing? He glanced at the door. If Ruby showed, at least he'd have her to himself. Most of the blokes had already tried flirting with Ruby Jones to no avail. Unlike him, they'd all given up. But Monty reckoned she was more than worth a little extra effort. They're not on sale yet, but I'm glad you're all so enthusiastic. She named the date. Be sure to find yourself a suit before then, and come ready to open your wallets for a good cause. And pray, sweet lady, what might that cause be? Curtis was laying it on a bit thick, but Faith only blushed and smiled a little wider. A fabulous charity called Dogs for Autism. They breed and train dogs to assist autistic kids. The dog becomes a companion that not only offers friendship, but also looks out for the child. What's autism? Asked one of the fishermen. Isn't it that rocking thing? Asked another. Monty's brother has a form of it, Adam informed them, nodding towards him. All heads turned towards Monty. He took a long swig of beer and nodded. He tried to smile, but it turned out more a grimace. Yeah. When nobody said anything, he realised he was going to have to give an overview to the uninformed. Reluctantly, he put down his beer. He racked his brain for a way to explain it that wouldn't prolong the conversation, but that was easier said than done. In the end, he chose the textbook definition, hoping he'd bore his listeners into a change of topic. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disability. People on the spectrum can have problems interacting socially, communicating with others, and some also have behavioural challenges. He made it general, not wanting to talk specifically about Will. Although autism is different for every person who has it, life is different for those with the disorder. People with autism don't think like you and me. The world is black and white to them, and Curtis slapped him on the back. Definitely sounds like a good cause. I trust there'll be alcohol to help us support it. Monty let out a breath of relief. Curtis's words were shallow, but his lecture had been a success. Everyone had heard enough, and no one asked any more about Will. Of course, Faith smiled, but we're not here to talk about the ball, we're here to celebrate Monty's success. She lifted her glass high in the air. I'd like to make a toast to my best mate, Daniel Montgomery, soon to be farmer extraordinaire. Watch out, sheep. If I know my mate, he won't take any crap. To Monty. She downed some wine, and although she tried to hide it, he noticed her grimace at the taste. To Monty! The rest of his friends lifted their drinks, cheered, and roared their support. Monty couldn't help but get caught up in their merriment. He nodded his thanks and took a satisfying swig of his own beer. Just when he thought life couldn't get any better, the door of the pub opened again. Chapter 7. At the sight of Ruby Jones walking through the door of the pub, Faith almost choked on her wine. Granted, it wasn't good wine, and she rarely drank quality stuff, never mind the house wine, but this wasn't the reason for her brush with death. She coughed and thrust her glass at Ryan, seriously surprised that Ruby had come. She knew Monty had invited her, but she'd never expected her to show up. Monty had harboured a crush on Ruby since she'd moved to town late the previous year. She'd technically been affiliated with the place for over a decade, but she'd been at boarding school when the Joneses moved to Bunyip Bay and had lived elsewhere since. Rumours abounded around the reason for Ruby moving back in with her parents after 10 years on her own, but neither she nor her parents appeared to have shared the truth with anyone. Local gossip said she'd split from a long-time love and lost her job in the bargain, that coming home was a last resort kind of thing. But as far as Faith knew, that was all it was, gossip. However, the facts spoke for themselves. Since her arrival, many men had tried to ask her out, but she turned every one of them down. She worked at the ag store, made only enough small talk to appear polite, and spent every spare moment with her 2 horses. Ruby had made no effort to involve herself in any local activities. Although she'd recently started giving riding lessons, and Faith had lost some of her netball players because of it. Horses, it seemed, had greater appeal than chasing a ball up and down a court. Most of the guys had given up trying to woo Ruby, but Monty never gave up at anything. Faith understood what he saw in her. What red-blooded male wouldn't like a tall, leggy, pretty girl who not only had the body, but knew how to dress it? Ruby was everything Faith wasn't. Feminine, sweet, and altogether too perfect for words. While Faith tried to appear unaffected by Ruby's presence, Monty rushed forward to welcome her. Although she flinched slightly at his effusive greeting, she smiled, and Faith heard her words as if they were tiny light bulbs going off inside her head. "Congratulations on the loan, Daniel." Ruby twisted a chunk of long black hair around her index finger. "You must be so excited to be buying your own farm. I really admire all the hard work you've put in to get where you are now." Faith had to take a sip of her ghastly wine before she screamed. If she'd had any doubts about her opinion of Ruby before, they evaporated now. She'd dressed up. Although that wasn't unusual in itself, Ruby always looked mannequin perfect and always had a silly flower stuck in her hair, and was settling on the stool next to Monty as if she had one goal in mind. This was exactly what she'd been scared of. Ruby suddenly deciding to recognise Monty's advances now that he had more to offer than a rented house, a sunny smile, and a hard-working attitude. But she'd die before she let Ruby take advantage of him. Of course, Monty beamed, Ruby's words like fuel for his silly crush. "Thanks. Can I get you a drink?" While Ruby scrutinised the selection of drinks behind the bar, Faith narrowed her eyes. "I'll just have a lemon, lime and bitters," Ruby announced eventually, "and I'll buy it." "No way," Monty argued. "I invited you. I'm buying." Ruby relented with a flutter of her eyelashes and a smile that made Faith nauseous. Until the other woman had arrived, she'd been happily trading quips with Monty's friends, many of whom were good-looking, all of whom were friendly, interesting, and nice. She'd only been teasing Monty when she'd said she wanted someone to take her home. She'd never been easy and didn't plan to start now, but keeping an eye on Ruby would make chatting with the guys harder. If only the gold digger had stayed home with her horses. A warm hand at Faith's elbow jolted her thoughts. She looked up to see Curtis's bemused smile. He gestured to her barely touched glass of wine now resting on the bar in front of them. "The wine not good?" She shook her head. "It's not really my thing," she admitted. Then she turned to Liam behind the bar. "Can I have a rum and coke instead, please?" Curtis laughed. "Now there's a girl after my own heart." He downed the remnants of his beer and said to Liam, "Make that 2. Here you go." Liam placed the glasses in front of them, and Curtis paid for both. "I could buy my own drink, you know," Faith told him. "I know." Curtis winked. "But that would mean you weren't indebted to at least stay talking to me for as long as it takes to drink it." "I can drink fast." To prove this, and simply because she needed it, she downed half the contents of her glass. God, it tasted good. Curtis raised his eyebrows, having not even tasted his first sip. "I'm impressed." She grinned, something deep inside her heating at the way he said those 2 words. As she took the next sip slower, she tried not to be obvious in checking him out. He wasn't what you'd call traditionally spunky. A bit skinny despite years of hard labour on fishing trawlers, his hair was neither long nor short, and its colour neither light nor dark. But he had a nice smile. A larrikin's smile, and Lord knew she was partial to larrikins. So, if you can drink like a man, does that mean you can play pool like one too? Curtis asked. Like a man? Damn it. She'd wanted to present a different persona tonight. Hence the clothes, hence the wine. Bugger Ruby for putting her off balance. Ryan, who'd been leaning against the bar ordering a second drink, overheard their exchange. He wrapped an arm around Faith's shoulder and pulled her against him. Can she ever? I taught her myself. Bloody brilliant. Curtis downed his drink, ordered another round from Liam, and called to a couple of his mates. Who wants to play me and Faith in a round of pool? So somehow Faith found herself at the other end of the pub with a bunch of rowdy but lovely blokes playing pool. She was so far away from Monty and Ruby she could barely see them, never mind eavesdrop. Try as she might, she soon found that playing the incompetent female just wasn't her either. The first time she deliberately missed the ball almost killed her. So after another couple of pretend attempts, she gave up on her feminine ploys. She played pool like a pro, drank as much rum and coke as any of the men, and had the time of her life. She even managed to forget about Ruby and Monty, and simply enjoy being around his friends. Curtis barely left her side, not allowing anyone else the chance of being her pool partner. Not that she minded. In fact, she thought she might fancy the crayfisherman pants off him. She wouldn't go back to his place tonight, but she planned on sending him home with her number. That sounds awesome, Monty said, trying to focus on Ruby. She'd been telling him about giving horse riding lessons to some of the local girls and how she hoped to build a little business for herself, but he couldn't seem to settle into the conversation. The girl of his dreams shrugged and smiled as she twirled her wine glass in her fingers. It doesn't feel like work, more like a paying excuse to spend more time with my horses. I was one of those horse-mad girls, so I understand the passion of the kids I teach. Yeah, I can relate to that. Monty nodded, his gaze drifting to the other end of the pub. Faith was down there with his mates, no doubt kicking their asses at the game. His eyes boggled as she took the cue, leaned right over the table, eyed the ball, and pushed her bum out as she set up her hit. Her little pink dress rode up the back of her thighs, giving him and everyone else in the pub a tantalizing view of bare leg, and then, when she leaned a little farther, black panties. A wave of awareness swept over him, and he contemplated Faith in a way he'd never done before. As he shook the unwanted thoughts aside, he noticed he wasn't the only man with eyes glued on Faith's behind. Curtis's mouth was wide open, his tongue hanging out like a dog on heat. The others were barely any better. He could just imagine what was running through their heads. Faith really did have the most sensational legs. Fighting the urge to rush over and cover them with his jacket, he let out a sigh of relief when she finally straightened, her dress fell, and an expression of triumph filled her face. Judging by her crazy victory dance, he guessed not one but two of her balls had dropped into the holes. The blokes cheered, and Kyle stepped forward to take his turn. Monty forced his attention back to Ruby. He'd wanted this opportunity for ages, Ruby Jones offering her undivided attention, and yet he was annoyingly distracted. He needed to stop acting like Faith's big brother and focus on his own needs. Ryan was with her at the pool table, and he'd look out for Faith if necessary. Besides, these were his mates, for crying out loud. Would he really think their admiring gazes leery if it was any other woman they were ogling? He took a long slug of his beer. So, he said, smiling as he met Ruby's gaze, who taught you how to ride a horse? My Auntie Sue used to run a stud in Narrogin. Dad managed a hardware store there before we moved up here to Bunyip Bay, and I spent every second I could with her, just watching her train the horses. She took a quick sip. While I was at boarding school, I spent more time at her place on holidays than I did up here. Eventually my parents bought me my own horse, Christy. Christy? He stifled a laugh. Strange name for a horse. Not for a little girl obsessed with the Babysitters Club. At his blank face, she elaborated. It's a series of books for girls. Christy was one of the main characters. I always admired her guts. She was sporty and confident, not shy and cautious like me. At the mention of shyness, pink tinted her cheeks. She was finally talking to him, sharing silly snippets of her history, and that made him want to puff up his chest and roar. Is Christy still around? She shook her head. No, she died a few years back. I'm sorry. He paused and then asked, Didn't you used to do dressage events and such? Yes, but... She bit her lip, shrugged. I think I'll be better suited to teaching other people how to ride. Fair enough. Anyway, enough about me. Ruby gestured to his now empty glass. Let me buy you another beer and you can tell me all about your new farm. She listened with interest as he shared his ideas for the future, making sure to mention the impressive stables at the Payne property, and Monty thought he was doing a good job of not glancing constantly to the other side of the pub. But when Ruby mentioned Faith, he realised he'd failed dismally. So what's the deal with you and Faith? She asked, a slight smirk on her lips. Huh? Her question threw him. Oh, we're old friends. She nodded, but the slight rise of her brow told him she didn't buy this explanation. Is that why you can't keep your eyes off her? Shit. No. No. He leaned forward, not wanting Ruby to get the wrong idea. She's just got a few things going on right now, and I don't want those blokes taking advantage of her. Ruby took a sip of her drink. I don't think she likes me. He swallowed. Why? Just a hunch. Every time she's looked over, she's given me the evil eye. I'd say she has the hots for you. He snorted, but didn't meet her eye. No way. We're just friends. After a pause, he asked, Can I get you another drink? She shook her head. No thanks, I can't stay much longer. But this has been nice. Congratulations, Daniel. Please, call me Monty. Everyone else does. Okay, Monty. His nickname on her lips sounded sweeter than he'd ever heard it before. As she straightened her handbag on her shoulder, his heart pounded ridiculously in his chest. He felt like a teenage boy garnering courage to ask his crush to the high school ball, when all he wanted was to ask her on a proper date. At last he found his voice. Ruby, I was wondering if you'd like to go out for dinner with me one night. We could head into Geraldton to one of the restaurants there. The muscles in her face stilled, and then, For a second he was certain she was going to refuse him, but then she seemed to rethink. Okay, that would be lovely, she said more forcefully. Give me a call at the shop and we'll make arrangements. I will do. Monty watched her leave, wishing there had been a moment to lean forward and kiss her, at least on the cheek. But her brief hesitation had halted any ideas he had about making a more definite move. He'd been patient until now, and he could wait a few more days. As Ruby headed for the door, Faith and the others left the pool table and migrated back to the bar. Monty figured his mates had finally got sick of being slaughtered by a female. He didn't blame them. He'd learnt years ago not to take her on at pool, cards, or anything that involved competition. She didn't like losing. Smiling widely, Faith landed on the stool beside him. Her cheeks were flushed and her words a little slurred. Where's your girlfriend? Gone home to get her beauty sleep? Don't, Faith. Being a bitch doesn't suit you. Faith sighed, obviously hurt. I'm sorry? So why'd she rush off then? Not sure. He tried to keep his smile in check, but I asked her out to dinner and she said yes. Wow. Faith didn't hide her surprise, but looked away at the same time. In a flat voice she said, That's awesome. Well done you. 2 things to celebrate. And with that she held up the glass Curtis had just passed her and gestured for him to clink. Thanks, Forrester. With a smile he accepted her toast and then drank to the future. After that, the evening progressed like most evenings at the palace. Everyone took turns punching songs into the vintage jukebox, dancing and singing along like they were in some kind of contest about who could make the most noise and look the most ridiculous. Just when Monty thought maybe it was time to call it a night, Curtis suggested tequila shots. For a second he wondered if Curtis was trying to get Faith so plastered she'd go home with him, but he told himself to get a grip. Faith could handle her drink, and Curtis was a good bloke. Vowing to stop acting like her father, Monty grinned as Curtis turned to the bar to order. He could already imagine the state of his head tomorrow morning, but what the hell? You didn't get approved for a loan and make an offer on your dream farm every day. As his fingers closed around the tiny shot glass, his mobile phone vibrated in his pocket. Wondering who in hell could be calling at this time of night when almost everyone he knew was right here beside him, Monty lifted the glass, threw back his head, swallowed the liquor in one quick gulp, and then, bypassing the lemon, retrieved his phone. A glance at the caller ID, and his heart leapt up to his tonsils. Mac, his real estate agent. Monty headed outside for some quiet, then cleared his throat and pressed accept. Hi, Mac. At the other man's news, he sobered up pretty damn quick. His fists clenched. Monty only just refrained from throwing his phone against the bricks of the pub and then punching the wall. Why me? As he recalled Mac's words over and over in his head like a nightmare on replay, his mother's stupid love of numerology haunted him. She'd always joked he had unlucky numbers, but damned if he hadn't thought you made luck for yourself. Monty? He spun around at Faith's voice and realised too late he was actually crying. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hands and turned away, walking towards the car park. Even Faith, who'd been his best mate for almost 30 years, had only seen him cry on a handful of occasions, none of which were in the last 2 decades. What's happened? Is it your parents? Will? No. He stopped walking. Trust Faith to think bad news would be family-related. Something happening to your family was the worst that could happen to most people. Then what? She stepped forward, right in front of him, and her hands reached out for his. What's happened? He swallowed. Mac rang. The Paynes have taken their property off the market. Oh, shit, no. Her hand squeezed his. Why? Apparently they have a nephew who wants to get into farming. He's convinced them to lease the farm to him for a few years, and he'll buy it off them when he can. Oh, Monty. I don't know what to say. That'd be a first. He tried to joke, but saying his bad news aloud made it seem more real. She didn't even smirk. The seriousness in her eyes was testament to the fact she knew this meant the world to him. There'll be other farms, you know. This isn't the end of your dream. I know. As usual, Faith spoke sense, but there weren't loads of other farms on the market in Bunyip Bay, and Bunyip Bay was where he wanted to be. He'd need time to get his head around looking elsewhere, but if that's what had to be done, then so be it. After having all his hopes pinned on the Paynes farm, he couldn't bear going back to toiling on other people's properties and watching the rewards of his hard work reaped by someone else. Are you going to come back inside? Faith asked with a shiver. It's glacial out here. Trust me to choose the first freezing night of the season to road test my sexy outfit. He laughed at her attempt to lighten the mood. She was right about the sexy part, but he didn't want to think on that right now. Mostly he wanted to slink off back to his place and nurse his sorrows alone, but the fighter in him wanted otherwise. Doing that would feel as if he were admitting defeat when defeat wasn't an option. Sure, he said, drawing Faith into his side in an effort to warm her some. This is just a minor setback, but we still have the loan to celebrate, right? Right. She grinned, her eyes lighting up in that way only hers could. Thanks, he said. You're the best mate ever. You too, Monty. You too. Chapter 8. Faith hung up the phone and put another tick on her spreadsheet. Between the household chores and collecting eggs from the chickens, she'd spent the morning drafting a list of businesses and individuals who might be able to sponsor the barking ball and had set to work straight away, contacting those she could on a weekend. She grinned at the impressive list. The Shire had offered the hall free of charge, the printer in Geraldton had offered a massive discount on the invitations, and loads of shops in Bunyip Bay had donated goods or vouchers. 2 more calls and she'd reward herself with one to Monty. Monty. She sighed deeply as he once again took prime spot in her thoughts. Her heart had broken for him last night. How could the Paynes get his hopes up like that and then take it all away? If she hadn't been drinking, she'd have climbed into her 4-wheel drive, driven over, and had it out with them herself. The night had been so good until then. Curtis had gone home with her number punched into his phone and left her with the imprint of his lips on her cheek. But when she'd lain down to sleep, all she could think about was how Monty's arms had felt around her as they'd walked back inside the pub. She shivered at the memory. Last night she'd been cold and worried about him, but what was her excuse this morning? Thank God her sleep had been dreamless. She didn't think she could look him in the eye after another raunchy dream. Focus. 2 more calls and then you can ring him. She punched the number of a local textile artist into her mobile. Simone was Adam's cousin and the widowed mother of one of her netball girls. They hadn't had much to do with each other, but Simone's animated personality was well known in Bunyip Bay. In addition to raising 2 girls and doing her art, she volunteered for a number of local committees and had organised a number of major events in her time. She answered on the second ring. Hello? Hi, Simone. It's Faith Forrester here. I wonder if I could steal a moment of your time. Oh, hi, Faith. Sure. Is this about netball? No, I'm actually organising a ball for a couple of months from now. Long story short, it's a fundraiser for Dogs for Autism, an organisation that— I know it, Simone interrupted. My nephew in Sydney is autistic, and my sister-in-law is desperately trying to raise funds to get him one of those puppies. How can I help? Well, I'm planning to have an auction on the night, and I wondered if you'd consider donating one of your fabulous artworks. Yes, and more yes. But can I help with anything more practical? I'd be happy to assist with the actual organisation of the ball as well. Faith grinned at the excitement in Simone's voice. She was the first person she'd spoken to who had known about the charity already. Are you sure? That would be awesome. I will need to put together a small group of volunteers. Consider me your first recruit. When do we start? Still smiling, Faith spent the next 10 minutes outlining her plans. After arranging to meet in town the following week, they said goodbye. Faith barely had time to tick Simone off her list when her mobile buzzed with an unknown number. Frowning, she answered, Hello, Faith Forrester. Faith, purred a semi-familiar voice down the phone line. It's Katerina Lamborusco-Cunningham. How are you? Good, thanks. Faith frowned, wondering why Kat would call her. I'm taking over from Priscilla as Ms. Alumna of the Year Coordinator, and I wanted to touch base to see if everything was going okay. Are you on track? Oh, just what I need. Yes, it's all going well. As if Kat hadn't heard her speak, she barreled on. Because if you need help or don't think you can manage, sometimes people pledge on the night and then realise it's not their thing. We can work something out. No, it's fine. Faith spoke through gritted teeth. On a scale of 1 to 10, Kat irritated her more than perfect Ruby. Preempting her next question, she added, I'm organising a ball to fundraise for Dogs for Autism. I've just organised the invitations and— Kat cut her off. That's lovely. Sounds like you're on the ball. She laughed, and Faith realised she'd been trying to make a joke. When her giggles faded, she asked, Is that lovely man of yours helping? How is he? So consumed was she with thoughts of the ball, it took a second for Faith to realise who Kat meant. Here was her chance to say they'd broken up, but somehow different words fell from her mouth. Monty, he's splendid, really supportive of what I'm doing and willing to help in any way he can. Her thoughts drifted once again to his muscular arms offering warmth last night. What would it take to get that image out of her head? They were only arms, for goodness sake. Curtis had actually touched her with his lips. That's just fabulous, Kat said. Faith imagined her Botox smile. I can't wait to meet him. And he you. As if that would ever happen. Anyway, it's been fabulous chatting, Katerina, but I really must go. My to-do list for today is as long as a freight train. All righty then. You just remember I'm only at the other end of the phone line if you need any help or support. We'll speak soon. I look forward to it, Faith lied, more than happy to disconnect the call. Strictly speaking, she hadn't made 2 phone calls, but 2 conversations had been had, and that was good enough. She leaned back in her swivel chair and made the call she'd been dying to make all morning. I was wondering how long it'd take for you to call, came Monty's greeting after only 1 ring. She laughed. And a very good morning to you too. You sound better than I expected. I'm fine. Disappointed, of course, but there's no need to worry. I'm not about to do anything stupid. He knew her so well, but it was good to hear the relaxed tone in his voice. That was one thing she loved about Monty. Nothing could keep him down. What are you doing then? Well, right now, I'm nailing floorboards down on the cottage veranda at Adams. Hardy-ha, I meant what are you going to do about your loan, about getting a farm? Mac's looking for properties farther afield. I can't just sit around and wait for someone else in Bunyip to decide to sell. She'd expected that. It was the advice she'd rushed to give him last night. But the thought of him actually moving away again made her insides ache. She swallowed, vowing not to let her feelings come into this. The last thing she wanted was to make her best friend feel guilty about following his dream. "Of course not. Let me know if anything comes up," she said. "You'll be the first to know. I'll talk to you later." "All right. Bye, Monty. See you soon." Faith smiled at the phone a moment after disconnecting, happy that he wasn't going to let one setback get him down, and then she returned to her work. When another call interrupted her planning only 5 seconds later, she decided she might need a PA. She answered, and her grin grew when she recognized the caller's voice. "Hi, Curtis." "Too soon to call? Do I look too eager?" She laughed. "No, not at all. I'm happy to hear from you." "In that case, what would you say to dinner in Gero Friday night? Maybe a movie afterwards?" "I'd say that sounds like a lot of fun." "Awesome. Can you pick me up? I don't know if my old bomb will make the distance." Sure. You'll have to give me your address, though. I don't actually know where you live." He made a snorting noise. "Don't worry. Half the time I don't either. I'm camping out on a mate's floor until the cray season is over and we head to Queensland. I've got another mate there who's got some jobs lined up for us." "So you're not staying in Bunyip Bay?" The question slipped out before she thought about it. "Nah." He paused a moment. "That's not a problem, is it? You're not looking for marriage, kids and the whole shebang, are you?" Her foolish heart sunk a little. She'd managed to snag the attentions of yet another guy who just wanted a bit of fun. Was there a flashing neon sign on her head that read, "Perfect for a great time, not a long time"? "No, of course not." She forced amusement into her voice. "I'm only 29. "Exactly," he said. "Plenty of time for that serious bizzo later." "Yeah, plenty." So why had her day just taken a nosedive? This is the end of CD 2. The book continues on CD 3. CD 3. Chapter 9. Over the next week, Faith kept busy cooking stews and smoko snacks for the upcoming seeding season and working on plans for the fundraiser. She'd set the date for the last Saturday in June, when hopefully most farmers would have finished seeding. With Simone's help, she'd booked the memorial hall, started designing the invitations, and begun drafting press releases for the media. Faith relished the busyness, but grabbed every opportunity to get away from Forrester's Rock, because life at home hadn't improved at all. Her dad had barely spoken to her all week. The grunts he gave her to pass the broccoli at dinner didn't count. So many times she wanted to scream that she hadn't stopped picking up his socks or cooking his favourite desserts, despite her threats to do so, so why, oh why, couldn't he just smile at her occasionally? She felt trapped. On the one hand, she didn't want to leave Forrester's Rock, but on the other hand, she couldn't go on living in such a toxic place. She prayed for rain and vowed that once seeding was over, once the ball had been ticked off her list, she'd have it out with her father. She'd held off far too long, not wanting to cause disharmony for her mother's sake, for her memory. But disharmony was already here, and it was time to face it. At the sound of the front door opening and closing, Faith glanced up at the clock. Good Lord, it was almost 5, and she hadn't even contemplated dinner. She leapt out of her chair as Ryan entered the kitchen. "Hey, sis, what's for tea?" She racked her mind for what could be defrosted from the freezer while Ryan helped himself to a beer. The bottle hissed as he opened it. He took a long sip, smiled, and then said, "Haven't you got a hot date tonight?" "Oh, shit, is it Friday already?" She dropped her head into her hands and sank back into her seat. She was supposed to pick Curtis up in an hour so they'd make it to Geraldton for their 6:30 reservation at the Indian restaurant. "Don't tell me you've forgotten." Ryan's voice was incredulous. "You and Curtis seemed joined at the hip last week." Looks can be deceiving. Cancelling on him would have been a major disappointment a week ago. Now it didn't seem like that much of a deal, but she silently reprimanded herself. So what if Curtis didn't want long-term? She deserved to go out and enjoy a nice evening with a nice guy. "I'm sorry," She rushed her words as she stood up. "But you guys are going to have to make do with leftovers. There's leftover roast and mashed potato in the fridge and frozen veggies to go with it." Mostly Dad and Ryan complained about her giving them too many vegetables anyway. Ryan placed his beer on the table. "Go get ready, I'll handle dinner." "Thank you." She could have kissed him, but decided to save her affection for Curtis. Just because he didn't want to settle down didn't mean he wasn't up for a good time. And he was still cute as pie. Feeling rejuvenated by that thought, she all but skipped down the hallway to the bathroom. Her shower was quick, but she took more time, much more than usual, in front of the mirror, flossing, moisturizing, and even putting on makeup. Feeling like a clown under all the foundation, she fought the urge to grab the roll of toilet paper and start stripping off layers. But when she looked in the mirror, she gasped. Wow. Although a total amateur when it came to makeup application, she must have done something right, because she looked mighty fine, even if she did say so herself. She selected one of her new outfits from the wardrobe, pulled on her knee-high boots, and, bag in hand, skipped back down the hallway. Her dad and Ryan were sitting at opposite ends of the dining table, munching silently. She did a little twirl. "How do I look?" Ryan wolf-whistled. "Awesome, sis. She looks great, doesn't she, Dad?" Frank grunted, but Faith wasn't going to let anyone dampen her mood. She was beginning to enjoy glamming up a bit. Surprising her father, she kissed both men on the cheek and then wriggled her fingers in goodbye. "Don't wait up." Monty parked in front of the Joneses' impressive property on the edge of town, feeling like a high school kid come to take his sweetheart out for the first time. For the past half hour, he'd been battling visions of Ruby's father answering the door butt-naked with a shotgun. But when he saw Ruby waiting by the letterbox, his fears about seeing her parents evaporated. Scooping a bunch of beautiful cottage flowers off the passenger seat, he leapt out the driver's side and made his way round to greet her. His palms were clammy, but he hoped the tissue paper around the flowers would soak up his nerves. "Hi there," he smiled, inwardly cursing his naff greeting. Looking absolutely stunning in a black skirt and slim-fitting red top, Ruby stepped towards him and grinned. "Hi there, Monty." "Hi." He tried again as he offered her the flowers. Too late, he realized he should have kissed her on the cheek, but he wasn't thinking straight. How could he when the sight before him left him tongue-tied? She took the flowers, and as she sniffed them, her sleek licorice hair fell over her face and onto the petals. "These are beautiful, thank you. You must have gone to some lengths to get them." He chuckled. "You've obviously seen my garden." "That's not a garden," she said with a grin. "Okay, I confess, I may have sweet-talked Mrs. O'Neill into letting me raid hers." "Really? How? She's never once smiled at me in the shop. I know she has a nice garden, but I thought she got it through growling at her flowers to grow." Monty laughed and held open the passenger door while she slid inside. As she settled in the seat, he couldn't help but admire the slim, tanned legs emerging from her knee-length skirt. She looked up at him. "Are we going to go, or are you going to stand here all night breathing in the fresh sea air and staring at my legs?" "Go, yes." He jumped into action, slamming the door and almost tripping over his feet to get to the driver's side. "You're really funny, you know that, Monty?" He cringed at her words as he turned the key in the ignition. Funny was good when you were out with your mates having a few beers, but he wanted to be so much more than funny tonight. "I aim to please." "So tell me," she said, settling back into the seat as he reversed out the drive, "how did you wheedle those flowers out of Mrs. O'Neill?" "Absolutely no wheedling involved." For the half-hour journey to Geraldton, Monty explained the various odd jobs he did for some of the pensioners around town. Weeding, landscaping, renovating kitchens and bathrooms, laying patios and fixing broken hinges. You name it, he'd done it. She couldn't believe the stories he told her, of being offered biscuits, cakes, stews, even having his clothes mended. "Last winter, Mrs. Wiggins knitted me a jumper." "It just doesn't add up." She shook her head. "The women you describe sound so different from the women I know." "It's the Montgomery charm," he said, hoping it was working its magic on Ruby as well. "But enough about me and Bunyip Bay's old-age pensioners. I want to know about you." He heard her quick intake of breath. "There's not much to know, really. When I'm not looking after my horses, I'm usually helping Mum and Dad at the shop. I really need to get a life." He didn't buy this simple summary. There was so much more behind those dark eyes, and he wanted to know it all. But he didn't want to scare her off with too much prying. As the lights of Geraldton came into view, his stomach rumbled in anticipation of the feast ahead. "Have you been to this place before?" he asked. Faith raved about it, but he'd never been himself. "No, but I've heard it's great, and I'm starving." "That makes two of us." Less than a minute later, Monty turned into the car park of the Indian restaurant and stole another quick glance at the gorgeous woman next to him. Yeah, life was good. Waiting 20 minutes for Curtis to get ready at his friend's place hadn't been the best start to their date, but he'd been good company in the car. The journey to Geraldton went quickly, with Curtis telling the funniest and rudest knock-knock jokes she'd ever heard. But when Faith pulled into the car park at the restaurant and saw Monty's ute, an uneasy feeling swept over her. "That's Monty's ute," she announced before she could think not to. "Maybe we should go someplace else. The fish and chip shop near the foreshore is good." "No, I'm up for Indian." Curtis smacked his lips together. "Who cares if Monty's here? He's a good bloke." Yes, that fact was undebatable, but... "He's on a date. I don't want to cramp his style." Curtis actually hooted. "So what? So away!" And he stretched one arm over the back of the seat, across her shoulder, and squeezed. "Maybe we can double date." Oh, sheesh. She fought the urge to thump her head against the steering wheel. It felt like she was out with a teenager. How could she tell Curtis that Monty wouldn't want to double date, that he was serious about settling down and offering one lucky lady commitment, that he was serious about Ruby? Curtis wouldn't understand. "Okay, we'll go in." She turned off the ignition and decided to ask the waiter to seat them at the opposite end of the restaurant from Monty and Ruby. Yet the moment they stepped inside, she saw this would be impossible. Her Monty radar zoned in on him immediately, and the only table available in the packed restaurant was right behind theirs. She could have kicked something. A waiter approached them. "Can I help you?" He sounded stressed. Faith could relate. "We have a reservation," Curtis announced, pulling Faith into his side, "under Faith Forrester." The waiter found their booking in his list, then made a show of looking at his watch. "You're very late." He glanced back over his shoulder at the busy restaurant. "We have only one table left." "It'll be fine." Faith tugged out of Curtis's embrace, not wanting to cause a scene. "Right this way, then." The waiter smiled tightly, gestured for them to follow, and led them to the table right behind Monty and Ruby. Leaving two menus on the table between them, he stepped away. So enthralled were Monty and Ruby in each other's company that they didn't seem to notice Faith and Curtis sit down. Curtis took the chair facing the others, and Faith sat down opposite, very aware that her back was only a ruler's length away from Monty's. She could almost feel the heat coming off him, and she grappled with a ridiculous urge to turn around and take a look. Had they been leaning across the table, eager to get as close to each other as possible? Had they been holding hands? A funny pain shot to her temple at the thought. She rubbed her fingers against the spot. "You okay?" Curtis peered over the top of his menu. "Fine, just a little tired." She picked up her own, although the thought of food made her stomach revolt. "Hey, Monty!" Curtis called past her, loud enough that half the restaurant turned to look. Her cheeks flushed as a chair shuffled behind them. "Curtis, Faith, fancy seeing you here." When Monty spoke, he didn't sound delighted to see them. She'd briefly mentioned their date to him during the week, but hadn't included specifics. "Great, isn't it?" Curtis grinned. Monty was lost for words. Classic. "We're seeing a movie later on. Why don't you join us?" And then Faith heard Ruby's perfectly prim voice. "That would have been lovely, but I have to get back. I'm working in the shop tomorrow morning and have to get up early to see to my horses first. Thank you for the invitation, though." "Hello, Faith." Succumbing to the inevitable, Faith turned around to greet her friend and his date. Monty looked illegally good in snug-fitting jeans and a crisp grey shirt. He had some sort of gel in his hair. She'd never known him to make such an effort, and the sight made her mouth go dry. "Hi, Ruby. Hi, Monty." "Evening." Monty bowed his head. "I didn't know you were coming here tonight." The undertones were clear. If he had known, he'd have taken Ruby someplace else. Nor did I you, Faith said through a forced smile. They'd talked about his bank loan, the search for a farm, and her organisation of the ball, but for some reason neither had gone into detail about their upcoming dates. Well, I hope you have a good evening, Monty continued, as he and Ruby's next course arrived, and the waiter came back to take Faith and Curtis's order. It was a welcome relief from the awkward conversation, but as the waiter walked away, Faith couldn't recall what either of them had ordered. "Any ideas on what you want to see tonight?" Curtis asked her. Waiting for her answer, he poured them both a glass of water from the pitcher on the table. "I don't mind," she said, unable to summon excitement at the thought of sitting in a darkened movie theatre for a few hours. Without realising it, she leaned farther back in her seat. "What kind of movies do you like?" Even before he replied, she guessed the answer. Curtis had action and adventure written all over his face. As he launched into a long spiel about the movies he'd watched in the last year, she only half listened. While making noises in what she hoped were all the right places, she craned her head back, straining to hear Monty and Ruby's conversation. "Unfortunately, the chance to buy the Payne farm has fallen through." "Oh, Monty, I'm so sorry," Ruby crooned. Faith shifted slightly and glared at Curtis's glass, searching for a reflection of the scene behind her. But all the glass reflected was the brightly coloured paper lanterns strung across the ceiling. "It's fine," she heard Monty say. "One setback's not going to hold me down. I'm already on the lookout for the next place." "Good for you." There was a clink of glasses. Faith had a flashback to Monty's table and the expensive bottle of champagne sitting between them. She was suddenly desperate for a drink, but neither she nor Curtis had thought to bring anything. "So you're happy to see it, then?" Curtis spoke loudly, as if this wasn't the first time he'd asked. Reluctantly, Faith refocused her attention on him. "Yes, that's fine." It didn't matter what movie she'd agreed to see, because her mind would be elsewhere. "Great." But Curtis didn't sound that impressed as he took a slug of water. They sat smiling, not comfortably, at each other for a few long moments. Faith guessed Monty and Ruby were eating because their conversation had paused too. All she could hear was the clink of cutlery against plates. "When are you off to Queensland?" she asked, smiling and trying to feign enthusiasm. "Will you work on boats there too?" Curtis shrugged. "Not sure. I might pick up some bar work until the picking season really gets going." "I've heard fruit picking is hard slog." He leaned across the table and wiggled his bushy eyebrows. "Don't you think I'm up to it, sweetheart? I'll have you know this body can do things that would blow your mind." Faith managed a laugh and a quick smile. If he'd spoken to her like that last Friday night, shivers of anticipation would have sown goosebumps all across her skin. But knowing all he wanted was a quick tumble between the sheets dimmed his appeal. If she'd met him 10 years ago, she might have taken him up on the offer, but now she wanted a lot more. "Have you worked the orchards before?" she persisted. More than happy to talk about himself, Curtis linked his hands behind his head and leaned back in his seat like it was a couch. But it wasn't his words that claimed her attention. "I can't even imagine how hard it must have been having a brother like that." Like that? Faith cringed at Ruby's tone. Trying to look riveted by Curtis, she leaned farther back in her seat, wishing she had some kind of supersonic hearing. "You're lucky you're an only child," Monty replied. Although his tone was light, anyone who knew him as well as Faith could detect it was forced. Gobsmacked by this admission, her mouth fell open. How had she never known he felt this way? Monty had always been so caring and protective of Will. She shook her head, deciding her ears must have failed her. "Will's needs always came first," Monty continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't get me wrong, I understand he needed so much more than me, but my parents never even thought about what was best for me. I hated leaving the farm, moving to Perth." Phew, at least Faith knew that much. "I know I was only young, but it was like they didn't spare one thought to my future, only Will's. So many times I wished for a normal brother or sister, one I could fight with, have a joke with, one I didn't have to explain to people wherever we went. I know I'm selfish and horrible." Monty's voice drifted off, and Ruby's came again. "You're not horrible. Everything you've said is totally understandable. Just because you want what's best for you doesn't mean—" But Faith didn't hear what Ruby had to say. Her mind was whirring like an inferno. Why had Monty never told her any of this? She couldn't think of anything he didn't know about her, well aside from the dreams she'd been having recently, and yet he hadn't shared this massive thing with her. This big ball of resentment lived inside him, and she'd never realized. What did that say about their friendship? She placed her hands on the table and pushed up out of her seat. Back in a moment. As she headed for the restrooms, she passed the waiter bringing their food, but the last thing she felt like doing was eating. Rushing into a cubicle, she flicked the lid of the toilet down and sat there, staring blankly at the back of the door. She thought back to that day she'd told Monty about the barking ball, and recalled he hadn't seemed very enthusiastic about supporting an autism charity. Why hadn't she called him on it? She racked her brain for any other clues she might have missed, but came up short. As much as she liked the idea, she couldn't hide away in the restroom all night. Even if this date was only a bit of fun for Curtis, it was rude to leave him out there waiting while their food got cold. But she wasn't ready to head back to the table and hear more revelations. Grabbing some toilet paper, she wiped her eyes, then blew her nose, and tossed the paper in the bowl. The flush of the toilet masked the sound of someone else entering the bathroom, and when Faith stepped out of her cubicle, there was Ruby. "Are you okay?" She sounded genuinely concerned. "I saw you rush in here. Are you sick?" "Just a headache," Faith answered tersely, amazed at how easily the lie fell from her lips. Although it wasn't exactly a lie, her head did ache, just not in the migraine need a Panadol kind of way. Ruby began digging around in her fancy handbag. "I've got a painkiller if you like." Before Faith could concoct an argument, she conjured a green and white packet and popped out 2 capsules. The easiest thing was to take them and make her escape. Yet even after she cupped her hands and gulped water from the taps to swallow the tablets, Ruby didn't go. Faith dried her hands under the automatic dryer, hoping Ruby would get bored and return to Monty. She didn't. And the moment the room went silent again, she pounced. "Monty's been telling me all about your fundraiser. I think it's a lovely thing you're doing. I'd love to help if I can." What? Was it a conversation about the ball and its charity that had led to Monty's confession about Will? Whatever, the idea of working alongside Ruby exacerbated her headache to unbearable proportions. Catty Faith escaped. "Why are you suddenly interested in Monty now?" Ruby blinked. "Excuse me, I'm not sure what you mean." Faith sighed. It looked like she was going to have to spell it out. "He asked you out when you first came to town and you never even looked twice at him. Suddenly now, when he's going to buy a farm, have land for your precious horses, now you pay him attention." "You haven't the slightest clue about me, Faith." Ruby's voice was soft, her tone icy. "I know Monty has asked me out before, but the truth is the time wasn't right. I wasn't ready for a relationship. I'm sorry if that offends you, but that's your problem, not mine." Ruby didn't wait for a reply. Clasping her shoulder bag against her side, she turned on her impressive black heels and hightailed it out of the room, leaving Faith staring into the mirror and wondering how much of her proclamation was true. She blinked at her puffy red reflection. Ugh. If Monty and Ruby did make a go of it, things would change in Faith's friendship with him. If she didn't at least try and make an effort with Ruby, she could lose Monty altogether. Psyching herself up to apologize, Faith stepped out of the restroom, but Monty and Ruby were already on their way out. Monty's hand rested intimately against the small of Ruby's back as he opened the restaurant door with his other one. They made the perfect couple. Faith felt her best friend in the world slipping away, and her mind tortured her with thoughts of what Monty and Ruby might get up to for the rest of the night. Back to the table, she found Curtis halfway through his dinner, mustard stains at the corner of his lips, and something yellow caught between his front teeth. "Glad you didn't wait," she said as she slipped into her seat. "Too famished," he replied through a mouthful of food. "Dig in, this tucker's great." She still wasn't hungry, but desperately needed something to distract her thoughts from Monty and Ruby. Taking a mouthful of chicken korma, Faith smiled at Curtis. It was a forced smile, one that felt totally awkward and uncomfortable on her face. But being in such a strop wasn't fair to him, when all he'd ever asked of her was a fun night out. "Now, You were telling me about fruit picking. Two hours later, as Faith sat in a dark theatre shoveling popcorn into her mouth and watching an awful romantic comedy, she wondered why she was putting herself through this hell. She wouldn't watch Jennifer Aniston on the small screen for anyone, and yet here she was suffering through 2 hours of The Woman magnified. She'd bought her own ticket, and Curtis had had the audacity to ask her for a loan so he could buy some munchies as well. Didn't he know it was still the done thing to at least offer to pay when you asked a woman on a date? What the hell did he do with his money anyway? Working on crayfish boats wasn't exactly stalking the stock market, but she knew from Monty that they did all right. And Curtis didn't even have to pay rent. By the time the credits rolled up the screen, Faith could have burst out in song. She turned down Curtis's suggestion that they find a pub still open and floored it back to Bunyip Bay. She was neither surprised nor disappointed when Curtis didn't ask her in or try to kiss her goodnight. As she headed back out to Forrester's Rock, she couldn't help thinking her night would have been much more enjoyable if she'd been with Monty. The mere idea of more dates with strange men exhausted her. All that effort to dress up and offer stimulating conversation. Maybe she simply wasn't cut out for relationships. Was it time to accept the fact that where men were concerned, she wasn't one of the lucky ladies? Monty had hoped that Ruby's reason for turning down Curtis's offer was because she'd rather spend some quality time alone with him. But when he asked her back to his place for coffee, she politely declined, making that same excuse about having to get up early and tend to her horses. Damn her bloody horses. They may have ruined his plans for soft music, a bit of wine and late-night conversation, but they would not rob him of what he'd been anticipating all night. A kiss. He'd barely tugged his keys out of the ignition before he leapt out and rushed around to open the passenger door. Ruby got out and stood awkwardly in the space between the car and the open door. Garnering courage, he stepped towards her, took hold of the hand that wasn't holding her small bag, and caught her gaze. "Thanks for a wonderful evening." She opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't want to miss the moment or lose his nerve. Under the glimmer of a street lamp, he leaned forward, closed his eyes, and pressed his lips against hers. They were soft, yes, but strangely cold, and although his lips were hot with desire, there was nothing. He'd expected fireworks, explosions, earth-shattering sensations. But sadly, he'd experienced more spark the last time he'd eaten a chocolate bar, and he wasn't even that fond of chocolate. Disappointment clenched in Monty's gut. Maybe it was like watching a movie that everyone had raved about and built up hype. Maybe he'd been expecting too much and just needed to give it time. What was that old adage about practice making perfect? He pulled back, determined not to let the disappointment show on his face. The woman before him was sweet and beautiful and everything he'd always desired. And it wasn't just her charm and good looks. Quite aside from her loveliness, there was something about Ruby that intrigued him. An air of mystery. Tonight he'd spoken more about himself than he had in a long time. She had a knack for making him talk about things that he normally kept very closely guarded. But now that he thought about it, she'd been reluctant to share anything personal about herself. Ruby licked her lips, and Monty wondered if she'd felt something more than he had. Her cheeks glowed a sweet shade of red, but her eyes gave nothing away. "Thank you too. It was lovely. Will I hear from you again?" "Yes, definitely." He wasn't about to give up on the woman of his dreams simply because their first kiss hadn't blown his socks from here to New York. "Stay close to the phone," he instructed with a smile as he stepped out of the way to let her pass. "I'll look forward to it," she said. Then she leaned forward and pecked him on the cheek before swishing her hips up the garden path. He palmed his cheek where her lips had been, but damn it, there was still nothing. Chapter 10. Where most women she knew would have nursed a broken heart with chocolate and a soppy movie marathon, Faith spent the weekend watching Star Wars, all 6 of them, with salt and vinegar chips, her snack of choice. The movies were as good as comfort food for her. She and Monty used to dress up as Princess Leia and Han Solo and take to the paddocks to defeat the Galactic Empire. She knew the words of each movie off by heart. Princess Leia had been her favourite fictional heroine as a child, and it was comforting to return to a place she knew so well, a place where things were still how they should be. Of course, she wasn't nursing a broken heart, merely a soul wounded by life's injustices. She had a long reel of questions on permanent replay in her head. Why did my mother have to die? A favourite whenever she felt like this. Why does Dad have to be so grumpy all the time? Another chestnut. She could understand his ill temper if she'd landed on the couch and hadn't moved. But between movies, she'd kept up her end of the household bargain. She'd collected the eggs, milked Daisy, made lunch and dinner, and kept the never-ending washing churning, all the home duties that drove her insane with the unfairness. And still he'd only glared at her before going on to complain about the damn weather to Ryan. Sometimes she felt as if it were her fault the skies hadn't opened yet, her fault they might have to dry seed for the first time in years. Did he want her to go out onto the front veranda and do a rain dance? Another question. Why wasn't I born a bloody male? Okay, maybe she didn't really want that, but it sometimes seemed an easy answer to her problems. If she'd been a boy, she felt certain her dad would have made room for 2 sons on the farm, but a daughter? Definitely not. All she was good for was taking up household chores where her mother had left off. Then there were the big ones. Why was Monty so intent on wooing the one woman who rubbed her up the wrong way? And why did she? Although answers to these questions weren't forthcoming, by Sunday night Faith had come to one conclusion. She needed to find Ruby and apologise. It would be as bitter as swallowing a lemon whole, but she'd do it because it had to be done. She needed to make an effort, for Monty's sake if not her own. She might even ask Ruby to join the Barking Ball committee. Thus, semi-enthused, she dragged herself from the couch, went to help Ryan with cleaning the kitchen, then showered, washed and blow-dried her hair ready for the morning. After that she fell into a deep slumber. Who knew slothing could be so damned exhausting? Faith, wake up! Dripping with sweat and tangled up tightly in her bed covers, Faith opened one eye and registered Ryan leaning over her. His fingernails dug into her shoulders, and he had a worried expression on his face. She tried to speak, but her heart was hammering too fast. "You were having a nightmare," Ryan told her, his grip finally loosening. "It was so loud you woke the both of us. I couldn't just leave you." As she looked up into Ryan's concerned eyes, a vivid flashback to that nightmare surfaced in her brain. Oh, sheesh. She tried to extricate herself from her blanket, almost tripping in her rush to get out of bed. "I think I'm going to be sick," she exclaimed as she fled from her bedroom. She couldn't get the image out of her head. The local uniting church dressed up in flowers and bows, harp music wafting from the front. Monty dressed in a suit, tails, top hat and all. Crowds and crowds of people. Her father and Ryan, Jenny, Stuart and Will Montgomery, Adam and even old Mrs. O'Neill. Monty's cousin Laura's little son and daughter were a sweet picture of page boy and flower girl. There were even a couple of Ewoks, which should have alerted her to the fact it was all a dream. At first she'd thought it was her wedding day. The bright orange dress should have been hint enough, but it was Ruby walking down the aisle in the most stunning white gown ever, who had sent Faith screaming from the church. What did it all mean? Her sordid dreams, which were embarrassing but enjoyable at least, had transformed into this. She'd never get any sleep again if this nightmare haunted her every night. And realization slammed into her gut like a dodgy Chico roll. What if Monty did marry Ruby? But was it Ruby that worried her so damn much, or was it... She lurched forward and hurled a weekend's worth of salt and vinegar chips into the toilet bowl. No, she couldn't be thinking like this. "Are you okay in there?" Ryan stood at the door to the bathroom, which in her haste she'd forgotten to close. "Can I get you anything?" "A drink of water, please." She grabbed a flannel, wiped her mouth, and washed her face. Ryan returned with a glass of cold water and she said, "I woke Dad too, hey? Just something else for him to hold against me." Ryan smiled sympathetically as he leaned against the door jamb. Was that what the nightmare was about? Or did you eat something bad? Funny that despite her dad being hell to live with lately, that wasn't her biggest woe. But she said yes, lying because she didn't want to admit what the dream had really been about. Once she spoke her strange new feelings aloud, there'd be no taking them back. You really need to talk to him, Ryan said, and for one scary second, Faith thought she'd voiced her thoughts out loud. Dad, he said, replying to what must have been confusion on her face. Who did you think I meant? Faith sighed. No one. I've tried talking to him, but I think it might be better coming from you. I know. She really should, but there just seemed too much else to think about right now. I will, after seeding. He's stressed enough as it is at the moment. All right then. If you're okay now, I'm going back to bed. I need my beauty sleep. I'll be fine, she replied with a forced laugh. Even as his sister, Faith could see that Ryan didn't need any beauty sleep. He was almost too handsome for his own good. She, on the other hand, would benefit immensely from a few good hours of rest, but something told her it wasn't going to be easy. Mac? Monty held his phone tight against his ear, trying not to let the hope overwhelm him. Morning, the real estate agent replied. Good weekend? Damn the weekend. Monty wasn't in the mood for small talk. Yeah, not bad. Yours? Busy. A real estate agent is never off duty. Mac chuckled. I think I may have stumbled upon gold for you. It's a little outside the brief, but hear me out. I found a farm going for a good price, way under the market. Cattle is currently the main source of income. Cattle? Most of his experience was in sheep and crops, but he could learn. Monty tried to quell his excitement. Tell me more. The current owners are way past retirement and their children aren't interested in taking over the property. They want to move closer to their grandies. Thing is, they don't want to sell to one of the big companies. They won't sell to anyone they don't believe in. I think they'd believe in you, Daniel. Where is it? He wanted to know the whole picture before he dared to let the hope grow. Mac paused. About 8 hours south. He mentioned a town Monty had heard of, then added, It's about half an hour from Mount Barker. 8 hours. That would mean well and truly leaving Bunyip Bay behind. But if the price was right, what exactly do you mean by good price? Mac named a figure higher than Monty had been approved for. His heart plummeted, sparking an immediate ache in his gut. Thanks for thinking of me, Mac, but I can't stretch that far. Don't write Clancy's Breakaway off just yet. The name reminded him of a poem he'd had to learn at school, Clancy of the Overflow. He'd never been much of a reader, but Banjo Patterson's bush poem just happened to be the only poem that had ever gripped him. I'll be in town this arvo to do some business. Let's meet and run through the specs. Although reluctant to waste his time on pie-in-the-sky dreams, Monty knew Mac wouldn't mess with him. All right, I'm finishing up at the Burtons this morning. How about lunch at the cafe? Perfect. I'll see you there. As Monty put the finishing touches on the cottage, he tried to think of anything but a place called Clancy's Breakaway. But it was a hard task, and 4 hours later, as he sat across from Mac at Frankie's cafe, looking at images on the real estate agent's laptop, he finally let his dreams take him away. The first person he called after shaking Mac's hand was Faith, but her mobile went immediately to voicemail, and when he called her at home, the phone rang out. Twice. Desperate to share his excitement, he headed for the ag store where he knew Ruby would be working. He didn't want to tell everyone like last time, but neither could he sit on the news completely. It was only when he stepped inside the store that he realised what moving so far away, if it came off, would mean. Would Ruby even consider leaving Bunyip Bay when she'd only just come back? There would be plenty of room for her horses at Clancy's Breakaway, but still, it was a big thing to dump on someone so early in a relationship. That's if you could call one date and the promise of another a relationship. He hesitated by a massive pile of dog food bags. Monty. Ruby looked up from the counter and smiled. What a nice surprise. He strode towards the counter and decided to be upfront and honest. If they had any hope of a future, she'd be as enthusiastic about this prospect as him. Have you got a moment? Sure, I'm just about to take a tea break. Give me 2 seconds. He nodded and soon found himself sitting outside the front of the massive building, relaying to Ruby everything Mac had said. It's going to be very different from up here. The main crop is canola, the annual temperatures are a lot cooler, and the farm's current stock is cattle. All new things for me, but I've never been one to shirk a challenge. It sounds great. She sounded genuinely pleased for him. What's the next step? I'm heading down there tomorrow to check it out. He took her hand, and she glanced down at where their bodies connected. I'm serious about you, Ruby, and I hope that if this works out, it won't change anything between us. I hope so too, Monty. Her gaze met his again, and her cheeks flushed slightly. His body tightened as he stared down at her full red lips. He wanted so badly to kiss them properly. The moment seemingly perfect, he leaned forward, but she turned her head at the last second, and his lips brushed her cheek instead. Damn it. She laughed and extracted her hand, standing quickly. I'd better get back inside before Dad sends out a search party, but good luck tomorrow. I can't wait to hear all about it. If Faith had been the one behind the wheel, she'd have done a U-turn and zoomed back to the farm at the sight of Monty and Ruby sitting snugly on the bench outside the ag store. As Ryan was driving, Faith had to pretend the sight of them together didn't send her insides whirling again. Now they were holding hands and standing up. Was he actually kissing her? She wished she could have concocted some excuse to stay in the truck. By the time she'd undone her seatbelt and climbed down out of Ryan's massive Ford truck, Ruby had gone inside, leaving Monty on his own. He saw them and waved wildly, a smile threatening to leap off his face. Knowing Ruby was responsible for his goofy grin made the idea of going inside and making friendly conversation with the woman even less desirable. Ryan leapt out, eager to pick up the chemicals he'd had on order and get back to the farm. Don't be long, he called to Faith as she dawdled across the tarmac. Hey, Monty stepped towards her as she reached the shop's veranda. What brings you into town? I actually came to take Ruby up on her offer to help with the barking bull. You guys organising another date? She tried to smother the acerbic tone. That's awesome, he said, blatantly ignoring her question about the date. She'll be stoked to be involved, and I have news. Oh? Faith's heart pounded as a vision from her wedding nightmare hit. Not yet, please, not yet. I've just had lunch with Mac. There's a farm down south owned by this old couple. They need to retire but don't want to sell their place to the bigwigs. He's told them all about me and they're prepared to drop the price. Maybe even come to some agreement about paying them in installments instead of a bank, if I'll promise not to sell out either. Wow. It sounds too good to be true. Faith nodded. I thought so too at first, but Mac assures me they're deadly serious. They want to meet me first, of course, hear my plans for the place. Wow, she said again. Where is it? He told her the exact location, and her heart fell. While Faith tried to get her head around the thought of Monty moving so far away, he added, I'm going to check it out tomorrow. Can I come? She blurted the question before she had any time to think the idea through. He gave her an odd look. Really? Yes. With every second that passed, the appeal grew. It's a long way to drive all by yourself. I'll be staying the night, he added. Tim and Nora, that's the owners, said I can stay over if I'd like. I thought I'd camp. Sounds great. I'm dying to get away from here, even for a day. Things are so tense at home with Dad, and he and Ryan aren't seeding yet, so they won't miss me. I'll pack my swag. She paused. As long as you don't think Ruby will mind. He quirked an eyebrow. Why would she? Of course he'd ask this. He hadn't been privy to Faith's X-rated dreams, the kind of dreams no woman wanted another woman having about her boyfriend. I just thought... Before she had the chance to explain, he continued, It's a great idea. I'd love your opinion, and it'll be good to spend some time together. It's settled then. What time shall I come to yours? He shook his head. I'll pick you up. It's on my way anyway, but I want to leave early. Can you be ready at 5? Of course. She'd always been an early riser. Daisy got stroppy if she left the milking too late. Shall I pack some supplies? Food, drink, extra blankets? All of the above. Monty grinned and then gave her a quick hug. Don't let me get too excited about this. Promise you'll keep me grounded. I promise. She let her head fall onto his shoulder, relishing the warmth as his arms clung so naturally around her. This easy friendship was what she'd miss. Chapter 11. At 5 o'clock the next morning, as Monty's ute cruised down the long gravel drive to the homestead at Forrester's Rock, Faith stood ready and waiting. She'd bribed Ryan to milk Daisy and tried for an early night, but even after a busy afternoon spent baking and packing supplies, sleep hadn't come easily. Instead, she'd suffered another long night of saucy dreams and unfamiliar thoughts. Despite all this, adrenaline had her leaping from bed an hour ago, showering and dressing with time to spare. She used it to make bacon and egg sandwiches and 2 coffees for the trip. Monty's headlights almost blinded her as he pulled up a few metres in front of the house fence and its neglected garden. She waved and then stooped to pick up the travel mugs that were resting on the backpack at her feet. He leapt out of the vehicle like an Olympic hurdler. "Good morning," he called as he strode up the garden path. She cringed, worried that his loud, excited voice would carry into the house and anger her father, but then shook that thought away because she realised she didn't care. The next 2 days were about her and Monty. She could barely recall the last time they'd simply hung out, and she was looking forward to the long-overdue one-on-one time. Hopefully it would help eradicate the ridiculous thoughts she'd been having lately, the raunchy dreams and lingering glances at his more bulgy body parts. "Hi," she cleared her throat, which suddenly sounded husky, and then held out her morning efforts. He took the coffees, his fingers brushing against hers in the exchange. She sucked in a quick breath and turned away, focusing on the things at her feet. The sandwiches were wrapped in greaseproof paper and sitting on the top of an esky that held snacks for the rest of the trip. There was also her swag, a backpack containing her clothes and overnight necessities, and a slab of rum and colas. Oblivious to her less than innocent thoughts, Monty sighed deeply. "This coffee smells so damn good. I'll chuck the mugs in the ute and come back to help you." Faith stooped again, heaved the backpack over her shoulder, and picked up the esky. She felt like a pack horse as she stumbled towards the back of the ute, but the physical exertion helped to take her mind off other things, like how fabulous Monty's bum looked in tight jeans. "Here, let me take some of that. There's no need to break your back." Monty relieved her of the esky and placed it on the tray of the ute. He sounded stern, but the smile he offered was anything but. Did he know what she'd been thinking? Were her torrid thoughts scrawled across her face like badly applied lipstick? Maybe she should be putting some distance between them, rather than trekking out into the middle of nowhere alone with him. "I can handle it," she said, yanking the backpack off her shoulders and hurling it in next to the esky. Why was his smile suddenly having such an effect on her? "I'll just get my swag." By the time Faith had thrown her swag in the back, Monty had the ute started, and the sun was nudging the horizon. She slid into the passenger seat, feeling the excitement radiating off him. Usually, being with Monty was the easiest thing in the world, but her silly fantasies wouldn't allow her to relax right now. "You can choose the tunes." He handed her his iPhone, which connected to the stereo through Bluetooth. Getting comfy in her seat, she clicked the seatbelt into place and scrolled through his music, eager to focus on something other than her nerves. You'd think they were on a first date or something, the way her heart was vibrating. All she wanted was to be his mate, to share his excitement and have a bit of fun together. Why couldn't her body get back with the program? Let's start with a little regurgitator. Not romantic or suggestive in the slightest. Good choice. As he turned off the driveway, Monty put his foot on the accelerator and began the journey south. According to the map Faith had checked last night, they'd travel the Brand Highway to Perth and then take the Albany Highway farther south. There were a few towns sparsely scattered along their route, but Monty likely wouldn't want to pause, except for desperate pit stops, until they hit Clancy's breakaway. "Tell me more about this farm then," she said, unwrapping the first bacon and egg sandwich and handing it to him. He took a bite, moaned his approval, and then laid the rest on his lap atop the greaseproof paper. "It's predominantly a cattle property, but Max said they've run some sheep before, and I probably would again eventually. It's 800 hectares, has a 4-bedroom house recently renovated, 3 JP sheds, 12 dams, and 16 paddocks." She smiled at the fact he knew the stats off by heart. From what I know of the Great Southern, it's a really lovely place to live. Much greener than up here, and you can't be too far from Albany. About an hour. Guess we'll have to meet in Perth for long weekends or something. Yeah, definitely. But he didn't sound convinced. He'd likely be far too busy managing the farm on his own to get away. Faith had never been the sentimental or soppy type, but an uncharacteristic coil of emotion uncurled in her chest, aching at the thought of Monty becoming a special occasion-only friend. "Speaking of Perth," she said, hoping to redirect her thoughts before the sadness took hold, "are we going to stop in and see your parents?" He finished another mouthful of sandwich before speaking. "Nah, not this time. I know I owe Mum and Dad a visit, but I want to focus on the farm. I'll call them when we get back." Faith wanted to say that he was lucky to have parents who treated him with respect and were interested in what he did, and that he should make more of an effort. But, not wanting to nag, she settled for fair enough. Monty eagerly popped the last of the sandwich into his mouth, scrunching up the grease-proof paper and tossing it by her feet. "You are the best cook ever, you know that?" Any irritation she'd been feeling evaporated at his compliment. It was a rare occasion that anyone thanked her for cooking. "I'm glad you think so, because that esky is full of slices, biscuits and cakes to help us while away the drive." He glanced her way and assaulted her with his potent grin. "I knew it was a good idea to invite you." She snorted, ignoring the way her tummy tumbled pleasurably at his smile. "As I recall, I invited myself." "Whatever you like to believe, Forrester, whatever you like to believe." Grinning, she remembered the sandwich she'd barely nibbled and lifted it to her mouth to take a bite. "Seriously," Monty went on, "it means the world to have you here beside me. I know you'll give me an honest opinion. If you ever decide to leave Forrester's Rock, you can always come work with me. I'll probably need all the help I can get." She doubted that. While she loved the idea of working with him, she knew that such an arrangement still wouldn't fix the gnawing sense of something being not quite right in her life. Monty would no doubt be a far better boss than her father, but it would just be exchanging one unsatisfactory situation for another. She finished her mouthful and struggled to speak past the lump that had parked itself in her throat. "Thank you." "Oh, Faith." Apparently she hadn't managed to hide the emotion, because Monty slowed slightly and reached out, squeezing her knee in a show of comfort and support. Comfort and support, that's all it was, but the nerve endings on her skin danced at his touch, and she couldn't take her eyes off his hand. Every feminine part of her body came alive. It was a man's hand, a worker's hand, strong, tanned and roughened by calluses that somehow made it all the more sexy. For a moment she imagined what might happen if he inched his fingers higher, if she'd been wearing a short skirt instead of jeans. No! She yanked her mind from the gutter and tried to focus on what she wanted to achieve on this trip. Closeness to Monty, yes, but not this kind of closeness. Not the kind of closeness that made the apex between her thighs throb with longing. She wanted to ask him about Will, to get him to open up to her the way he had with Ruby. And damn it was her turn to speak. She shuffled in her seat so his hand slipped away, took a quick breath, and tried for a nonchalant smile. "I'm fine, honestly. I've been talking with Ryan a lot this last couple of weeks. He's promised me that once seeding is over, he'll make Dad talk. We'll sit down together and nut out how we can make the farm work for all of us. And if Dad still refuses to include me, then I'm going to apply for a proper job elsewhere. I'm also thinking about finishing my degree." The thought of the big decisions that lay ahead helped ease the lust that lay within. She took another bite of her now cold sandwich. Feeling as if he'd brushed up against a party sparkler, Monty pulled his hand back from where it had fallen on Faith's seat and stared at the straight road ahead. His heart pounded as he tried to recall if he'd ever felt that jolt of electricity at touching Faith before, but his mind came up blank. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was simply that she was changing and he needed time to get used to the new Faith. The image of her in that short pink dress had made more than an impression on him. It had imprinted itself in his mind. Since that night, every time he closed his eyes, he saw her long, long legs in those black boots, and relived the way that dress had ridden up as she'd bent over to play her shot. Stop it! So far, he'd succeeded in banishing the image with thoughts of Ruby. Sure, their date hadn't exactly been perfect, but they were still getting to know each other. The kissing would get better with practice, and he wasn't opposed to putting in the effort. Even if he contemplated a relationship with Faith, which he never once had, there were so many reasons why it wouldn't be a good idea. She was his best friend in the world. He couldn't risk losing that if things went wrong. Not to mention that his mum would never forgive him if he mucked it up. But his fingers burned from their brush with her knee, and he suddenly wondered if this trip was such a good idea. As if totally unaffected, Faith rambled on about her home situation, and he tried to pay attention. He knew better than anyone what it felt like to leave the family property behind. Although Forrester's Rock was still in Faith's family, their situations were not dissimilar. He cleared his throat. I know your dad isn't ancient, but maybe you guys need to try and get him interested in doing something else with his life before he gets too old. Put the travel seed in his head or something. She laughed at that, and he felt the tension in his muscles wane. Now there's an idea. Once upon a time, he and Mum used to talk about going on an African safari. Maybe we can stop in at a travel agent on the way home and I can grab some brochures. Yes, and one for Antarctica. Maybe he'll get so used to the cold he'll decide he doesn't like the weather in Bunyip Bay anymore. Ha! So I'll have a brochure about seniors' tours of the North Pole ready and waiting on his return. She giggled. And maybe he'll meet some foxy widow with a mansion in Hawaii and run off with her. Hawaii? He shrugged. I've always wanted to surf over there. I figured we could visit. She socked him with a playful punch to the side of his arm. It's always about you, isn't it? Damn straight, he replied, trying to ignore his body's reaction to yet another physical interaction, which was all about her. Come on, she barely touched you. Anyway, right now my stomach is crying neglect. Do you have any of your famous custard and white chocolate biscuits in that esky? I can't believe you're hungry already. We've barely been on the road half an hour. But she was already unclicking her seatbelt. Pull over. While Faith retrieved the snacks, Monty drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and brainstormed safe topics of conversation. He'd never had to think about such things with Faith before. Come to think of it, he'd never had to with any woman. She returned moments later with a large Tupperware container, and as she peeled back the lid, the familiar aroma filled the cab. Here you go. She handed him a biscuit, and he took the first bite before pulling out onto the road. After he'd finished the mouthful, he said, How are the catering plans coming along for the ball? He heard the roll of her eyes in her response. The catering plans? She laughed. It's not all about the food, you know. There's plenty of other stuff that needs to be organised. Okay then, how's all of the planning going? Anything you need my help with yet? Really good, actually. I've started a small committee. Ruby mentioned something about that. She's really excited about helping. It's nice of you to ask her. You saw Ruby last night? He detected the irritation in her voice and decided to ignore it. No, we spoke on the phone. Oh. There was a telling pause before she continued. Well, it's all coming together nicely, actually. The Shire offered the use of the hall for free. Simone Taylor is almost finished with the promo stuff. You should see the poster and invitations she's created. Amazing. Who'll get an invitation? He asked, happy they were finally talking normally. We're sending one out to everyone in Bunyip Bay and the surrounding towns. Jake at the post office offered to cover the costs of that as his contribution. We've written a press release that's going to media right across the state and to lots of schools as well. I'm hoping that parents with kids on the autism spectrum might decide to make a weekend of it. Will there be enough accommodation? He could just imagine the owners of the Highway Motel quivering under the increased load. 2 out of 15 rooms booked was considered a rush in that place. I've created a Facebook page with links to all the local accommodation spots, everything from B&Bs to farm stays. What about organising a bus to and from Geraldton so people could stay there? He suggested. That way you'd have loads more accommodation options. That's a brilliant idea. I could just kiss you. His lips tingled as he contemplated her doing exactly that, but he quickly moved the conversation on. I'd be happy to look into it if you like. Thanks, that would be awesome. As they continued their journey, Monty asked more about the barking ball. He didn't focus on the autism aspect, but on the mammoth organisation that was involved. It was a safe topic, nothing too personal or emotional for either of them. At least it wasn't if he didn't let himself think that way. Faith told him about the sponsors she'd approached for cash and prizes, the ideas she had for decorations, goodie bags, and the auction. As she rattled off all that needed to be done, more ideas popped into his head, and Faith welcomed them. Somehow he found himself accepting an invitation to join the organising committee. He figured it would give him an excuse to spend more time with Ruby. They refilled their travel mugs with takeaway coffees in Perth and were back on the Albany Highway before 10 o'clock. I haven't been down this way in years. Faith stared dreamily out the window as they climbed the hills just past Armadale. Come to think of it, this is as close as I've come to a holiday since Mum died. Me too, Monty said. Holidays had never been a big deal for him. He'd been far too busy working and saving to worry about getaways. If he closed a deal on Clancy's breakaway, he wouldn't care if he never had a holiday again. What was your favourite family holiday as a child? Faith's question broke his reverie and gave him pause for thought. Holidays had been difficult with Will. They'd never been overseas because he couldn't stand the confines of aeroplanes and didn't cope well with being so close to so many people. Once they'd gone interstate, driving across the Nullarbor to Sydney, but having to change motel rooms every day had been disastrous. When they returned, Jenny and Stuart had sworn never to go farther than they could drive in one day. The answer to Faith's question was easy. The few times we came back up to Bunyip and stayed at Forrester's Rock with your family. Oh, yeah. Boy, did we get up to some mischief. She moved slightly in her seat, putting up her feet against the dash. She'd slipped her shoes off, and he noticed her toenails were painted a soft shade of pink, so unlike the Faith he knew. So sexy. He shifted in his seat. Oblivious to his thoughts, she continued, Remember that time Will caught that redback spider? He shuddered. How could I forget? He still recalled the itchy pain of the spider injecting his venom and its rapid spread through his body. He'd been bitten while trying to get rid of Will's find before their mum discovered it. That's one trip to the doctor I hope I'll never have to make again. The anti-venom had been almost as bad as the actual bite. His gaze drifted again to her toes, part of her new effort to transform herself. He had to admit that any man looking at her feet would want to get to know the rest of her. Was that the reason for these unwelcome sexual thoughts about his best mate? Because he was worried about the type of guy she might hook up with? Was it some sort of perverted protective instinct? I don't know how your mum puts up with all those spiders, Faith mused, her words once again jolting him from his thoughts. You were really good with Will, you know. Monty snorted. Faith continued. I don't know if I ever said that, but I admired everything you did for him. All those times you stuck up for him against those bullies. It's a shame you don't get to see him more now. He briefly closed his eyes. Those times were hell. Times when he, Faith, and Will would kick a ball around the local park on the weekends Faith was not at boarding school. Will would watch other kids like they were a freak show, while the other kids thought it exactly the other way around. The worst time, Will had made a dig about one of the boys wearing his trousers too low and looking like the plumber who would come to fix the pipes that week. That was Will, always saying things as they were, never censoring his thoughts like other people did. He'd said it loud enough for the boy in question to hear, a beefy kid with piercings all over his face, ripped t-shirt, jeans, and a posse of equally intimidating friends. Will had suffered a punch to the face and a bloody nose, but it would have been so much worse if Faith and Monty hadn't intervened. You looked out for him too, he said, recalling how that particular day she'd pushed one of the teens to the ground and near on knocked out his teeth. Yeah, I know. Will's a cool kid. But he wasn't my brother. I didn't have to live with him. Looking back, I can see that must have been pretty tough. Despite all the things she and Monty had talked about over the years, they'd never touched on how Monty really felt about Will. He knew she adored his brother, and he didn't quite know how to reply, so he shrugged and made a joke of it. Wasn't that bad. At least I had expert help when it came to research projects. Other kids had to look up the World Book Encyclopedia. I had a brother who knew it practically off by heart. Faith laughed, but it wasn't her usual deep-bellied chortle. Lost in their separate memories, they drove on. Slowly the conversation drifted to other things. They commented on the few small towns they passed through, Bannister, Williams, Arthur River, Kojonup, and then another hour passed and they were nearly there. As Monty turned off the highway onto the smaller road Mac had given directions to, His sweaty hands began to slip on the steering wheel, and his heart rate picked up pace. On either side of the narrow roads were paddocks, much greener than the ones back home. It looked as if some of the local farmers had already started seeding, and his suspicions were confirmed when they went another 100 metres or so and saw a big tractor ploughing a field to their right. Monty wound down the window and let the fresh midday air wash over him. He took a deep, satisfying breath. It lacked the saltiness of the air in Bunyip Bay, but was beautiful just the same. Beside him, Faith remained quiet. He glanced across to see her gazing out the window, and she turned her head towards him. "We must be almost there," she said with a smile. As if her words had conjured it, a large banner-like sign loomed just off to the right in front of them. Even before they were close enough to read the words, Monty knew this was the place. A settled feeling, which he hadn't felt in years, flowed over him as he turned the ute and slowed just before the welcome sign. 2 large rough wood poles stood on either side of a rustic-looking gate. Held up by the poles like a bridge across the gravel drive was the large red and white sign announcing Clancy's Breakaway, Tim and Nora Patterson. At the bottom of the poles, blooms of everlastings littered the dirt. "It's like something out of a Western movie," Faith said. "Like a ranch. Like a home." Monty hadn't meant to say that out loud, but again that sense of rightness overcame him. Before Faith could reply, he leapt out and jogged ahead to open the gate. He hurried back to the ute, desperate to drive over the cattle grid and begin the adventure. This is the end of CD 3. The book continues on CD 4.